Hey guys, tonight we step back nearly 150 years to a world without smartphones, antibiotics, or even reliable indoor plumbing. You're about to wake up in 1880 America, and I'll be honest with you, you probably won't survive this. Not because you're weak, but because the average Tuesday in this era involves more physical labour, more discomfort, and more genuine peril than most of us experience in an entire year. The air smells different, the food tastes different, and that persistent ache in your lower back, that's just called being alive in the 19th century. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see this little community scattered across the globe, all drifting off together to the same strange lullaby of history. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes, and for a moment, you're not sure if you actually have. The darkness is complete, thick, almost physical. There's no glow from a charging phone, no LED indicator blinking from across the room, no streetlight filtering through curtains. This is genuine, uncut 19th century darkness, the kind your ancestors knew intimately, but you've probably never truly experienced. Your brain takes a few seconds to adjust to the reality that yes, your eyes are open, and no, you still can't see your own hand in front of your face. The first sensation that fully registers is cold. Not the mild chill of a thermostat set a few degrees too low, but a bone-deep, penetrating cold that seems to have seeped into the very walls of your home overnight. You're lying on a mattress stuffed with corn husks or perhaps horsehair, if you're fortunate enough to have a bit of money. The stuffing has shifted during the night, creating lumps and valleys that your body has unconsciously contorted around. Your back aches, your neck is stiff, and the blanket, a heavy wool thing that smells faintly of sheep and strongly of you, has somehow migrated to cover only your left shoulder and part of your chest. The floorboards beside your bed are going to be freezing. You know this. You've done this dance every morning of your life, and yet there's always that brief moment of denial, that hope that perhaps today the floor will have magically warmed itself. It hasn't. The boards creak as your feet touch down, and yes, they're exactly as cold as you feared. In fact, they might be colder, because there was frost on the inside of your window last night, and your home has about as much insulation as a determined sneeze could penetrate. You're not alone in this room. Depending on your circumstances, you might be sharing this space with a spouse, with children, with siblings, or with some combination of all three. Privacy is a luxury that most Americans in 1880 simply cannot afford. Families of 5 or 6 regularly share single rooms, sometimes single beds. The sounds of other people breathing, snoring, shifting in their sleep, these are the ambient noises of your existence. You've learned to sleep through almost anything, because the alternative is never sleeping at all. The chamber pot sits in the corner, and this is your first decision of the day. Do you use it now in the dark, trying not to wake anyone else? Or do you wait and brave the outhouse, which is located some 30 or 40 feet from your back door, across ground that is currently frozen solid and possibly covered in fresh snow? Most mornings, the chamber pot wins. You've long since abandoned any embarrassment about bodily functions happening in close proximity to family members. Modesty is another one of those luxuries that the 19th century didn't really have time for. The clock, if you're fortunate enough to own one, suggests it's somewhere around 4:30 in the morning, maybe 5. The rooster will confirm this soon enough, assuming the rooster survived the night. Predators are a genuine concern even in relatively settled areas. Foxes, raccoons, the occasional stray dog with more hunger than sense. Your chickens exist in a state of perpetual siege. But for now, the rooster lives, and his internal clock is about as reliable as anything mechanical you could purchase. You need light. This means locating matches, which you keep in a specific spot precisely because finding anything in total darkness is otherwise impossible. The match strikes, flares, and for a moment the room exists in sharp relief. The rough-hewn furniture, the clothes hanging on pegs, the faces of sleeping family members caught in that peculiar matchlight that makes everyone look vaguely haunted. You touch the flame to a candle or perhaps a kerosene lamp, and now you have enough light to begin the process of becoming a functional human being. Here's something that might surprise you. Kerosene lamps are actually relatively new technology in 1880. 25 years earlier, most Americans relied on candles or whale oil lamps, both of which were either expensive, dim, or both. The discovery of petroleum in Pennsylvania in 1859 changed everything, making artificial light affordable for ordinary families for the first time in human history. Historians still argue whether this was entirely positive. Cheap kerosene meant house fires became dramatically more common, and the fumes weren't exactly healthy. But it also meant that for the first time, a working-class family could afford to have light after sunset without calculating the cost of each hour of illumination. The cold hasn't gotten any better since you stood up, and it won't improve meaningfully until someone starts a fire. If you're the designated fire starter in your household, and someone always is, this is your next task. The stove or fireplace from last night has died down to embers at best, ashes at worst. You need kindling, you need wood, and you need patience. Getting a fire going from cold embers is a skill that modern people dramatically underestimate. It's not just a matter of throwing wood on and hoping. There's an art to the airflow, to the placement, to coaxing reluctant flames from materials that would really rather stay unlit. But let's say you manage it. Let's say the fire catches, the stove begins to radiate heat, and the immediate vicinity of your kitchen starts to feel marginally less like a meat locker. The rest of the house remains cold. Heat doesn't travel well through uninsulated walls and single-pane windows. Your bedroom will still be frigid tonight. Your breath will still be visible in the morning. This is simply how winter works when your only heat source is a fire that dies the moment no one tends it. The water in the wash basin has frozen overnight. This is not unusual. You break the thin layer of ice with your knuckles and splash the water on your face, and for a moment you understand exactly why people in this era don't wash very often. This is genuinely unpleasant. The water is so cold it hurts, and the idea of voluntarily immersing more of your body in it seems like a form of self-punishment that only the truly devoted would undertake. Outside, the world is beginning to lighten almost imperceptibly. Dawn, in 1880, America doesn't announce itself with smartphone alarms or radio DJs. It creeps in slowly, a gradual lessening of the darkness, a grey suggestion at the eastern horizon. The stars fade one by one. The rooster, right on schedule, begins his morning proclamation. Other animals stir, horses in the stable, if you have one, pigs in their pen. That one cow who always seems personally offended by the existence of morning. You're expected to work. Whatever your specific circumstances, farmer, factory worker, domestic servant, shopkeeper, the fundamental reality of 1880 American life is that everyone works, always, with almost no exceptions. The concept of a weekend doesn't exist yet. Saturday is a work day. Sunday offers church and perhaps a few hours of rest. But even then there are chores that cannot wait. Animals need feeding every day. Fires need tending. Children need minding. The idea that you might have 2 consecutive days free from labour would strike your 1880 counterpart as either a fantasy or a sign of dangerous laziness. The sun clears the horizon, and now there's enough light to see properly. Your home reveals itself in the honest light of morning. The cracks in the walls, the stains on the ceiling, the general wear that comes from buildings constructed by hand with imperfect materials. You've lived here long enough that you don't really see these things anymore. They're simply part of the backdrop of existence, as unremarkable as the air you breathe. It's time for breakfast, such as it is. But that, my friend, is a journey unto itself, and your stomach is already beginning to make suggestions about what you might find in the kitchen. The coffee pot awaits. The questions of what's edible and what's turned overnight remain to be answered, and the day stretches ahead of you, long and demanding and full of tasks that would exhaust a modern person by noon. The adventure is just beginning. Your stomach makes its demands known with a low, insistent rumble, and you shuffle toward the kitchen with that particular morning stiffness that seems more pronounced here, in this era of physical labour and unforgiving mattresses. The kitchen is marginally warmer now, thanks to the fire you started earlier, and the cast iron stove radiates a kind of grudging heat that doesn't quite reach the corners of the room, but does make standing directly beside it almost pleasant. Breakfast in 1880. America is not the bounty of choice you might be imagining. There is no refrigerator humming in the corner, keeping milk fresh and eggs chilled. There is no pantry stocked with cereals in colourful boxes, no bread that will stay soft for a week thanks to preservatives you can't pronounce. What you have is whatever you manage to preserve, store or acquire recently enough that it hasn't yet become inedible, and the definition of inedible in this era is considerably more flexible than you're used to. The coffee pot, A battered tin thing that has seen better days, better decades really, sits on the stove where it lives more or less permanently. Coffee in 1880 is not the artisanal, single-origin, carefully roasted experience you might know. It's often bought green and roasted at home, in a pan over the fire, by someone who learned the process from someone else, who was also just guessing. The beans are ground by hand in a coffee mill, a tedious process that's nonetheless preferable to buying pre-ground coffee, which might be adulterated with sawdust, chicory, or other creative additions by unscrupulous sellers. The resulting brew is strong. Thick, actually. So thick that the joke about coffee strong enough to strip paint isn't really a joke, it's a description. You drink it black, probably, because fresh milk requires having a cow or knowing someone who has a cow, and that milk needs to be used quickly before it sours. Sugar exists but isn't cheap, and besides, strong bitter coffee is what you know, what you've always known, what everyone you've ever met has always known. There's mush. There's almost always mush. Cornmeal mush, to be specific. What later generations will call polenta and charge $17 for in restaurants. You made it last night, let it cool into a solid mass, and now you're slicing it into slabs to fry in whatever fat you have available. Pork fat, probably. Lard is the universal cooking medium of this era, used for everything from frying to baking to waterproofing boots. If you're in the South or certain parts of the Midwest, the mush might be called grits, and there's a whole cultural identity wrapped up in how you prepare and serve it. Meat is on the table if you're lucky, but it's not the fresh from the butcher meat you're picturing. In most American households in 1880, meat means preserved meat, salted, smoked, dried, or pickled to keep it from spoiling in a world without refrigeration. Salt pork is ubiquitous, a fatty, heavily salted product that tastes mostly of salt and serves primarily to add calories and flavour to otherwise bland meals. Bacon exists but isn't quite what you're imagining. It's often prepared differently, cured differently, and doesn't always come in those neat parallel slices. The salt pork has been in the barrel in your root cellar for months. You try not to think too hard about this as you slice off a piece, rinse some of the excess salt away, and drop it into the pan where it begins to sizzle and render. The smell is familiar, comforting even, though a modern nose might notice undertones that suggest the meat is approaching the outer limits of palatability. You've learned to cut away the suspicious parts and not ask too many questions about the rest. Eggs are a blessing when you have them, but chickens don't lay as prolifically in winter, when the days are short and cold. Those factory-farmed hens producing eggs year-round regardless of season, they don't exist yet. Your chickens are just chickens, subject to the whims of nature and their own mysterious internal calendars. In spring and summer, you might have more eggs than you know what to do with. In January, you're counting each one as a small treasure. Here's a quirky detail that might surprise you. Many Americans in this era eat pie for breakfast. Fruit pies, meat pies, whatever you have leftover pies. The idea that pie is exclusively a dessert food is a later invention. Your grandmother probably had pie for breakfast regularly, and her grandmother definitely did. It makes a certain practical sense. Pie keeps better than many alternatives, provides a complete meal in a portable package, and can be made from almost anything. The bread on your table is homemade, almost certainly. Commercial bakeries exist in cities, but if you're in a rural area, and most Americans in 1880 still are, bread comes from your own kitchen. This means someone in your household, probably a woman, spends considerable time each week baking. The process is labour-intensive, mixing the dough by hand, kneading it until your arms ache, waiting for it to rise in a kitchen that might be too cold for proper proofing, punching it down, shaping loaves, and baking them in an oven whose temperature you control primarily through guesswork and experience. The bread itself is denser than what you're used to, lacking the airy texture that modern commercial yeasts and industrial processes produce. It's also often made with a mixture of flours, wheat if you can afford it, corn if you can't, and sometimes rye or other grains depending on what's available locally. Pure white flour is expensive and a marker of status. Most families eat bread that's darker, coarser and more flavourful than the pillowy sandwich bread of the future. Fruit at breakfast is seasonal and local. In summer and fall you might have fresh berries, apples, peaches, whatever grows in your region. In winter, you're relying on preserved fruits, jams, jellies, apple butter, dried apples, and the occasional jar of canned goods that you put up yourself months ago. The canning process in 1880 is still somewhat unreliable, and there's always a slight gamble when you open a jar from the cellar. Botulism is a real concern, though no one calls it that yet or fully understands why certain preserves make people sick. Water is a constant concern that threads through every meal. You don't simply turn on a tap and fill a glass. Water comes from a well, a cistern, a spring, or a nearby stream, and getting it to your kitchen requires effort, often significant effort. Some fortunate households have pumps, either hand-operated or in rare cutting-edge cases, connected to windmills that automate the pumping. But even then, the water isn't treated. What you're drinking is whatever was in the ground or running through that stream, complete with whatever organisms, minerals, and questionable additions came along with it. Historians still argue whether Americans in this era understood the connection between water quality and disease. The germ theory is gaining acceptance in scientific circles, but it hasn't fully penetrated popular consciousness. People notice that some water sources seem healthier than others, that certain wells are associated with sickness while others aren't, but the explanation for why remains murky. Many people drink beer, cider, or coffee not because they're trying to avoid pathogens, but because these beverages taste better than the water, and, coincidentally, the fermentation or boiling process has made them safer. Your breakfast table, if you're lucky enough to have a proper table, might also feature preserved vegetables, pickled cucumbers, sauerkraut, pickled beets. Pickling is one of the few reliable preservation methods available, and vegetables that would rot within days in their natural state can last for months in a salt and vinegar brine. The resulting products are intensely flavoured, sometimes overwhelmingly so, but they provide nutritional variety during the long months when nothing fresh is growing. Breakfast is not a leisurely affair. You eat with purpose, efficiently, refuelling for the work ahead. Conversation is minimal. There's too much to do and not enough time to do it. Children eat what they're given without complaint because the alternative is going hungry, and there isn't a parent in America who's going to make a separate meal for a picky eater. You eat what's put in front of you, you're grateful for it, and you get on with your day. The meal finished, you push back from the table and take stock. Your stomach is full, or at least no longer actively complaining. The coffee has provided a jolt of energy, such as it is. The fire in the stove needs more wood, the animals need feeding, and there are approximately 17,000 tasks demanding your attention before the sun sets again. But for this one moment, in the relative warmth of the kitchen, with food in your belly and the immediate demands of hunger satisfied, there's something almost peaceful about the morning. The dishes wait for no one though, and someone, probably you or someone close to you, is going to spend the next 30 minutes cleaning up from a meal that took less than 15 minutes to eat. Hot water must be heated on the stove, soap must be applied, and everything must be dried and put away before the day's primary work can begin. There are no dishwashers. There won't be dishwashers for another 70 years or so. Every plate, every pot, every fork and spoon gets the personal attention of human hands. But now it's time to face another daily ritual that you've been putting off, getting properly dressed. And in 1880, America, getting dressed is not the simple 3-minute affair you're accustomed to. The clothes are laid out on a chair or perhaps hanging from pegs on the wall. And looking at them now, you understand why people in old photographs always look so uncomfortable. It's because they were uncomfortable. The entire philosophy of clothing design in 1880 appears to be make it complicated, make it tight, and make sure the person wearing it can never forget, even for a moment, that they're dressed. Let's start from the inside and work our way out, because that's how you have to do it. There's no throwing on a t-shirt and jeans here. There are layers, strategic layers, each one serving a purpose and each one adding to the overall sense that you're slowly encasing yourself in fabric armour. For men, the first layer is your undergarments. A union suit if you're wearing the one-piece style that's becoming popular, or separate undershirt and drawers if you're more traditional. The union suit is essentially a full-body onesie made of wool, flannel or cotton depending on the season and your circumstances. It buttons up the front, extends from neck to wrist to ankles, and features a rather notorious buttoned flap in the back for, well, you can figure that out. The union suit keeps you warm, theoretically, and also ensures that you're never quite comfortable in any temperature. Over the underwear goes the shirt, which is not the fitted, tucked-in affair you might expect. Men's shirts in this era are longer, more like short gowns, and they're designed to be worn under everything else. The collar is often separate, a detachable piece of fabric that you attach to the shirt with studs, because for some reason that seemed like a good idea to someone. The detachable collar can be removed, cleaned, and replaced without washing the entire shirt, which makes a certain kind of sense when you remember that laundry is an all-day ordeal. Pants go on next, held up not by belt loops, which aren't common yet, but by suspenders. Braces, as they're properly called, clip to buttons sewn into the waistband of your trousers and loop over your shoulders to keep everything in place. This actually works quite well and is arguably more comfortable than a belt, though it does mean that removing your pants requires a more involved process than simply unbuckling. For women, the situation is considerably more complex, more uncomfortable and more time-consuming. You begin with your chemise, a lightweight undergarment that sits against your skin. Over that goes the corset, and the corset deserves its own paragraph because the corset is an engineering project disguised as clothing. The corset of 1880 is not quite the extreme waist-cinching torture device of earlier decades. Fashion has moderated slightly, but it's still a boned, laced, structured garment that reshapes your torso into the silhouette that society currently deems acceptable. Getting into a corset by yourself is technically possible, but significantly easier with help. Someone needs to pull those laces tight while you hold on to something sturdy and try to keep breathing. The finished product supports your bust, flattens your stomach, and makes bending at the waist, or taking a truly deep breath, either difficult or impossible, depending on how tight the lacing is. Historians still argue whether corsets were genuinely harmful to women's health, or if the dangers were exaggerated by dress reform advocates who had their own agenda. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. A moderately laced corset worn by a woman whose body had adapted to corset wearing since adolescence probably didn't cause immediate organ damage, but tight lacing for fashion certainly caused problems, and the restriction of movement was real regardless of how tight the laces were pulled. Over the corset goes the corset cover, a lighter garment that protects your outer clothing from sweat and wear. Then comes the petticoat, or more likely petticoats, plural. Multiple layers of skirts worn under your outer skirt to provide volume, warmth and modesty. Depending on current fashion and your personal resources, you might wear 2, 3, or even more petticoats. Each one adds weight, each one adds warmth, and in the summer you understand why women in old photographs always look like they're about to faint, because they probably were. The bustle is the fashion statement of the moment, and if you're keeping up with current styles, your skirt features a dramatic shelf-like protrusion at the back created by padding, wireframes, or specialised undergarments. The bustle makes sitting down an adventure in structural engineering. You can't simply drop into a chair, you have to account for the projection behind you, navigate the architecture of your own clothing. It seems absurd from a modern perspective, but fashion has always been about performance, about signalling, about belonging to your moment in time. The outer dress goes on last, and it might be one piece or two, a separate bodice and skirt. Buttons march up the back, often too many to count, tiny buttons spaced close together that you absolutely cannot reach without assistance. This is another reason why dressing was a communal activity in many households. You literally could not get into your own clothes without help. There's a profound lack of independence built into women's fashion of this era, a physical dependence that mirrors and reinforces social expectations. Shoes for both men and women are leather, often handmade or at least locally made, and they're not exactly ergonomic marvels. The concept of different shoes for left and right feet is relatively recent, and some cheaper shoes are still made on straight lasts that don't distinguish between sides. You break them in through wearing, essentially reshaping them to your feet through pain and persistence. Modern shoe technology, with its foam cushioning and arch support and shock absorption, is the stuff of pure fantasy. Here's a quirky detail about 1880s clothing: pockets. Men have them in abundance. Pants pockets, vest pockets, coat pockets, enough pockets to carry a small hardware store. Women's clothing, in contrast, has almost no functional pockets. Fashion dictates smooth lines, and bulging pockets disrupt the silhouette. Women carry small bags or have separate pocket bags that tie around the waist under their skirts, accessible through slits in the fabric. The pocket inequality will persist for over a century, a minor but constant reminder of how different men's and women's lives are expected to be. You're dressed now, or at least you've made significant progress. The entire process has taken perhaps 20 minutes if you know what you're doing, longer if you're fumbling with unfamiliar laces or stubborn buttons. You feel constrained. There's more fabric on your body than you've ever worn at one time before. The weight of it is noticeable, especially if you're in women's clothing. All those petticoats add up, and you're going to wear all of this all day while performing physical labour that would exhaust a modern athlete in gym shorts. The fabrics themselves deserve attention. Cotton is available and increasingly common, but wool remains the workhorse of American clothing. It's warm, it's durable, It handles moisture reasonably well, and it's domestically produced in great quantities. But wool in 1880 is not the processed, treated soft wool of modern winter coats. It's often rough against the skin, prone to itching, and becomes quite heavy when wet. The smart dresser puts cotton or linen between their skin and their wool layers, but even then, comfort is relative. Clothing is expensive and labour-intensive to produce, which means you have far fewer garments than you're used to. A working-class individual might own 2 or 3 complete outfits, one for daily wear, one for Sundays, and perhaps one for truly special occasions. These clothes are mended repeatedly, patched, altered, passed down through families, and worn until they literally cannot be worn anymore. The idea of a closet full of options, of declaring you have nothing to wear while surrounded by dozens of garments, would be completely incomprehensible. And the colour palette of your wardrobe is probably duller than you'd expect. Bright, colour-fast dyes exist but tend to be expensive. Synthetic aniline dyes invented in the 1850s have made colour more accessible, but many working people still wear browns, greys and muted blues that hide dirt well and don't fade as dramatically. Pure white is reserved for special occasions because white shows every stain and requires bleaching to maintain, bleaching that's done with caustic chemicals and significant labour. You check yourself, adjust what needs adjusting, and prepare to face whatever the day demands. Your clothing is armour in a very real sense, protection from the elements, from judgmental eyes, from the constant minor injuries of physical labour. It's also a statement about who you are, where you fit in society, and what you can afford. Every garment communicates something, and you've learned to read those signals in others just as they read them in you. The children are dressed similarly, in miniature versions of adult clothing that are slightly less complicated, but still more involved than any child should have to deal with. They too have layers and buttons and fabrics that require careful handling. Teaching a child to dress themselves is a significant milestone, one that takes years to achieve fully. Dressed, fed, and more or less awake, you're ready to confront the world outside your home. But you pause for just a moment at the door, bracing yourself for what waits beyond it. Because the world outside has its own challenges, its own sensory experiences, and its own particular brand of 1880 reality, starting with the smell. The door opens and the cold air rushes in, but it's not the cold that hits you first, it's the smell. The complex, layered, utterly inescapable smell of 1880 America, a bouquet that no history book can properly convey, and no amount of imagination can truly prepare you for. Start with the horses. In any town of reasonable size, there are hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They pull carriages, wagons, carts, fire engines, and anything else that needs moving. Each horse produces somewhere between 15 and 30 pounds of manure per day, and that manure goes somewhere. Ideally, it's collected by workers and carted away to be used as fertilizer, or dumped at designated sites. In practice, it accumulates on streets, in gutters, on the edges of sidewalks. It's kicked up by hooves and wheels, splattered on clothing and buildings, and dried into a fine dust that you inhale with every breath on a windy day. But the horses are just the beginning. Pigs roam freely in many American communities, serving as a kind of living garbage disposal system. They eat the organic waste that humans produce, which sounds practical until you remember that pigs themselves produce waste, and they're not particularly careful about where they leave it. Dogs, cats, chickens, and other domestic animals contribute their own offerings to the general atmosphere. Animal smells, the warm, pungent, unmistakable scent of creatures living in close proximity to humans, saturate the air. Now add the human element. Personal hygiene in 1880 is not what you're used to. Not because people are inherently less clean, but because cleaning yourself is genuinely difficult and time-consuming. We'll talk more about bathing later, but for now, understand that a full bath, hot water, soap, privacy, is a weekly event at best for most Americans. Between baths, you wash your face and hands, maybe your feet, maybe certain other areas if you're feeling particularly fastidious. But the comprehensive daily shower that modern people take for granted is simply not happening. This means people smell. Everyone smells. You smell. It's not polite to mention it because there's nothing anyone can do about it, so you've all collectively agreed to pretend it isn't happening. But the undertone of human body odour is present in every crowded space, every church service, every shop and streetcar. Perfumes and colognes exist but are expensive, and most people make do with whatever level of freshness they can manage. The privies contribute their own distinctive notes to the overall composition. Every household has an outhouse, a cesspit, or some combination of the two, and while these are typically located downwind and at a distance from living spaces, the smell travels. On warm days especially, the effluvia of human waste makes its presence known. In cities, the problem is worse. Sewage systems exist but are incomplete, and what passes for a sewer might be an open drain running down the middle of a street, carrying waste toward the nearest river while contributing fragrance to every establishment it passes. Industrial smells layer on top of everything else. If you're anywhere near manufacturing, you've got coal smoke, the thick, sulphurous, eye-watering output of a civilization that runs on burning carbon. Factories belch black clouds into the atmosphere. Locomotives add their own contributions. Every home that can afford it burns coal for heat and cooking, and the collective output creates a permanent haze over any city of size. On bad days, the air itself seems to have texture, seems almost chewy with particulates. Tanneries are legendary for their stench. The process of turning animal hides into leather involves chemical treatments that can be smelled from blocks away. Slaughterhouses and meatpacking plants generate odours that you don't want to think too carefully about. Soap factories, ironically, stink tremendously. The rendering of animal fats into cleaning products is not a fragrant process. Glue factories, fertilizer operations, gasworks. Every industry has its distinctive smell, and zoning laws that might keep them away from residential areas are minimal or non-existent. Here's a detail that historians still find remarkable. Many of the smells that we now find offensive were simply part of the background noise of existence. People didn't comment on them because there was nothing to comment on. This was simply how the world smelled. The idea that air could be odourless, that spaces could be sealed off from environmental smells, that you could choose what scents surrounded you. These concepts would have seemed as fantastic as personal flying machines. Inside your own home, the situation is different but not necessarily better. The smell of coal or wood smoke permeates everything. Food preparation leaves lingering odours. That salt pork from breakfast, the cabbage from last night's dinner, the perpetually simmering stock pot that recycles every scrap of food into future meals. Unwashed bodies in close quarters contribute their share, and that basement smell, the damp, earthy, slightly musty undertone that rises through the floorboards, is simply part of living in a structure without modern ventilation or moisture control. Perfuming your home is possible but expensive. Dried flowers and herbs might be placed strategically, but their effectiveness is limited. Some households burn scented candles or incense on special occasions. Most people simply grow accustomed to their own particular household smell and only notice others when visiting. This is probably the same way you experience it. Your nose has already begun to adapt, to filter out the constant inputs, leaving you aware of new smells without being overwhelmed by the persistent ones. The water contributes its own olfactory signature. Depending on your source, it might taste and smell of iron, sulphur, vegetation, or simply that indefinable old water quality that suggests things you'd rather not think about. Well, water picks up whatever minerals and organic material the groundwater passes through. Cistern water, collected rainwater stored in underground containers, can develop interesting qualities over time, especially in warmer months. Let's talk for a moment about what you don't smell, or at least smell rarely. Flowers, perfumed soaps, scented laundry detergent. The manufactured fresh scents that modern products pump into every corner of contemporary life, those don't exist yet. The smell of a modern person's home would strike an 1880 observer as peculiar, artificially fragranced in ways they'd find either delightful or unsettling. You've traded one set of smells for another, but the 1880 set is undeniably more organic. Disease has its own smell, though people don't always recognise the connection. Sick rooms have a particular quality: the stale air, the body-fighting infection, the various treatments and poultices. Certain diseases were actually diagnosed partly by smell. Experienced physicians claimed they could identify specific conditions by the odour of a patient's breath or skin. How accurate these claims were remains debated, but the idea that illness changed how a person smelled was taken seriously. The outside world continues its olfactory assault as you step further from your door. Nearby, someone is burning trash. Garbage collection is inconsistent at best, and what isn't fed to pigs or composted is often simply set on fire. The smoke adds to the general atmosphere. A neighbour is keeping chickens in their backyard. You can smell them before you see them. The road itself, whether dirt or the occasional paved surface, carries whatever has been spilled, dropped, or deposited on it. Everything from horse waste to discarded food to the mysterious substances that drain from passing wagons. On the positive side, and there is a positive side, you also smell food cooking. Fresh bread from the home bakery down the street, meat roasting at the butcher's, coffee being roasted at a shop that does its own preparation. The market, when you pass it, offers a riot of scents. Fresh vegetables, ripe fruits, fish, spices, cheeses in various stages of pungent maturity. Food smells anchor you, remind you that life continues, that there are pleasures mixed in with the challenges. You've adapted more than you realise. The human nose has a remarkable capacity for filtering out constant stimuli, for deciding what's worth attending to and what's just background. After a few hours in this world, you'll stop noticing most of the smells that initially overwhelmed you. After a few days, they'll seem normal. After a few weeks, a modern environment would probably strike you as weird, sterile, antiseptic, lacking the rich complexity of actual life. But for now, in these first moments, the smell of 1880 America is impossible to ignore. It's the smell of a world that works differently, that processes its waste differently, that relates to animals and industry and human bodies differently. It's not better or worse than what came before or after. It's just profoundly, unmistakably different. And speaking of things that work differently, let's talk about water, because everything you've done this morning and everything you'll do today depends on getting enough water to where it needs to be. And that, in 1880, is far from simple. Water is life. You've heard that phrase before, probably, but in 1880 America, it's not a philosophical statement. It's a job description. Every drop of water you use for drinking, cooking, cleaning, bathing, or washing clothes must be obtained through physical effort. And that effort shapes your entire day in ways that modern people can barely imagine. Let's start with the source. If you're lucky, truly lucky, you have a well close to your home, maybe even on your own property. The well is a hole in the ground lined with stones or bricks to prevent collapse, dropping down to wherever the water table sits in your particular geology. A bucket on a rope descends into the darkness, fills with water, and gets hauled back up by someone's arms. That someone, very often, is you. Drawing water from a well is exercise, genuine muscle-building, sweat-producing exercise. The bucket itself weighs several pounds empty. Full of water, you're hauling somewhere between 20 and 40 pounds straight up, hand over hand, however many feet your well requires. You do this multiple times a day, every day, because water doesn't store itself and yesterday's supply is already gone. If you're particularly fortunate, your well has a pump, a cast iron hand pump that sits at ground level and lets you draw water without the bucket and rope system. This is easier on the arms but still requires significant effort. You grab the handle, work it up and down, and water eventually sputters from the spout into whatever container you've positioned below. The pump can freeze in winter, requiring thawing before it works. The mechanism can break down, requiring repair. But when it works, a pump is a small marvel of labour-saving technology. Some households rely on cisterns instead of, or in addition to, wells. A cistern is an underground tank that collects rainwater from your roof. When it rains, water runs down your roof, into gutters, through a pipe, and into the buried container. This sounds efficient, and in many ways it is. Rainwater is softer than groundwater, better for washing, and doesn't require the daily effort of pumping. But cisterns depend on rain, which doesn't always cooperate with your schedule. A dry spell means an empty cistern means hauling water from somewhere else. In rural areas without convenient wells, you might depend on a spring or a stream. This means carrying water, in buckets, in barrels, in whatever containers you have, from the source to your home. Distances vary, but even a quarter-mile walk becomes significant when you're doing it multiple times daily while carrying 40 pounds. Young people and women do most of this carrying, and the physical toll is real. Shoulders ache, backs protest, and the water never stops being needed. Here's a detail that might surprise you. The amount of water you actually use per day is a fraction of modern consumption. Contemporary Americans use somewhere between 80 and 100 gallons per person daily. In 1880, a typical person might use fewer than 10 gallons, not because they need less water biologically, but because every gallon requires labour to obtain. You learn quickly to conserve, to reuse, to make every drop count in ways that would seem obsessive today. Water for cooking is relatively easy. You just need enough for the pot, and cooking water often gets reused afterward for washing or other purposes. Water for drinking should be the cleanest you can manage, though clean is a relative term when you can't see bacteria and don't fully understand why some water makes you sick. Families often have specific vessels designated for drinking water, kept separate from washing water, treated with slightly more care though without the benefit of modern purification. Washing dishes and clothes claims most of your water supply. We'll talk about laundry separately because it deserves its own extended horror story, but even daily dishwashing requires heating water on the stove, which requires hauling water to the stove, which requires the endless cycle of bucket to destination that defines 1880 hydrology. Hot water doesn't come from a tap. It comes from heating cold water over a fire you also have to tend. Nothing is automatic. Nothing is easy. Historians still argue about the actual health impacts of the 1880s water consumption. Waterborne diseases were rampant. Cholera, typhoid fever, dysentery, and various other gastrointestinal delights spread through contaminated water supplies. But people didn't always make the connection between the water they drank and the illnesses that followed. Symptoms might appear days after exposure, making cause and effect difficult to establish. Some communities had good water, others had deadly water. Luck of geography played as much role as anything else. Cities present their own water challenges. Urban areas in 1880 are beginning to develop municipal water systems, networks of pipes that bring water from reservoirs to individual buildings. If you're in a developed part of a major city, you might actually have running water, or at least water that runs from a tap in your building or courtyard. This is a luxury that's spreading but far from universal. Many city dwellers still rely on public pumps, shared wells, or water delivered by cart. The water delivery business is substantial. Entrepreneurs with horse-drawn carts make their living bringing barrels of water to homes that can afford the service, but don't have convenient access to their own supply. You see them on city streets, the horses straining against their loads, the barrels sloshing as the wagon navigates uneven roads. Water has weight, and moving it requires energy, whether that energy comes from human muscles, horsepower, or eventually steam-driven pumps. Personal hygiene suffers because of the water situation. We'll talk about bathing shortly, but understand that the connection is direct. Getting clean requires water. Getting water requires work, and there are only so many hours in a day. You make choices constantly about what's worth the effort. Washing your face? Probably yes. Washing your clothes more than once a week? Probably not feasible. Bathing your entire body? That's a production, an event, something you plan for and anticipate. The quality of water varies tremendously depending on source and location. Some well water is pure, clean and delicious. Natural filtration through rock and sand producing something better than any modern treatment plant can match. Other well water contains iron, sulfur or other minerals that affect taste and sometimes health. Stagnant water from cisterns or slow-moving sources can develop organisms that even the untrained eye might notice. Strange colours, odd textures, smells that suggest caution. You've likely developed a relationship with your water source, learned its quirks and qualities. That well on the Johnson property has the best water in the county. The creek is fine after a rain, but suspect during dry spells. The cistern develops a taste in August that you've learned to ignore. This local knowledge passes between neighbours, between generations, and shapes daily decisions about where to draw water and how to use it. Ice is a luxury that's becoming more accessible thanks to the ice harvesting industry. In winter, workers cut massive blocks from frozen lakes and rivers, store them in insulated ice houses packed with sawdust and sell them throughout the summer. If you can afford regular ice delivery, you might have an ice box, an insulated cabinet that uses ice to keep food cool. This isn't refrigeration as you know it, but it's a significant improvement over nothing. The Iceman cometh, as they say, and his arrival is a small event in the weekly rhythm of household life. Water for animals adds to your daily labour. If you keep livestock, and many households do, even in semi-urban areas, those animals need water too. Horses drink between 5 and 10 gallons per day. Cows need even more. Pigs, chickens, dogs, cats. Everyone gets thirsty, and you're the one making sure that thirst gets satisfied. The sheer physical presence of water in your daily life is something modern people rarely experience. You think about water constantly because you have to. You know where the nearest sources are. You know how much remains in your containers. You know who's responsible for hauling the next batch. Water isn't something that happens in the background, it's a central organising principle of domestic existence. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the small building out back. The one you've been avoiding this morning. The one that smells faintly even from here. The one that represents both a necessary convenience and a never-ending source of maintenance. The outhouse awaits. There it stands, at the edge of your property. The privy, the necessary, the little house, the backyard throne, the outhouse. Approximately 20 to 40 feet from your main dwelling, positioned thoughtfully downwind if whoever built it was paying attention, painted or unpainted depending on your inclination toward decoration, and representing both the solution to and the source of significant daily inconvenience. You approach it with a certain resignation that's become second nature. The door creaks on its hinges. Outhouse doors always seem to creak, as if the universe demands some auditory warning before you confront what's inside. The interior is dim, lit only by whatever light sneaks through cracks in the boards, and the small crescent moon or star cut into the door, which is both decorative and functional ventilation. Those shapes, by the way, have become so associated with outhouses that we remember them centuries later, though historians aren't certain whether the specific symbols ever had the ladies and gentlemen significance that legend assigns them. The seat is a wooden plank, or perhaps two planks, with holes cut at appropriate intervals. One hole, two holes, sometimes three or more for larger families. The idea of bathroom privacy is largely a luxury that the 19th century doesn't fully embrace. Families often have multi-seat outhouses because sometimes more than one person needs to go at the same time, and waiting isn't always an option. You learn not to think too hard about this. You develop the ability to conduct necessary business while maintaining conversation, or at least comfortable silence, with a family member sitting 6 inches away. Below the seat is the pit, and the pit is where everything goes. Depending on how long this outhouse has been in use, and how often it's been maintained, the pit might be relatively fresh, or approaching capacity. When a pit fills up, and they all fill up eventually, you have options. You can hire someone to dig it out, a job so unpleasant that specialists called night soil men exist specifically for this purpose, usually doing their work after dark to minimise the aesthetic impact on the neighbourhood. Or you can simply dig a new pit, move the outhouse structure, and fill in the old hole. Some families cycle through multiple pit locations over the years. The toilet paper situation would horrify a modern sensibility, because toilet paper, as a commercially manufactured product, exists but isn't yet universal or cheap. Many households use whatever's handy, pages torn from old catalogues, newspapers, almanacs, or the Sears Roebuck catalogue, which has earned a place in American bathroom legend specifically because of its secondary function. Dried corn cobs are traditional in some regions, available, absorbent and renewable. Leaves work seasonally. The wealthy might use actual manufactured toilet tissue, but for most people, waste not, want not, extends even to this most personal of rituals. The smell inside the outhouse varies with season and maintenance. In winter, the cold suppresses bacterial activity, and the experience is almost tolerable beyond the temperature, which is brutal. You sit on a wooden seat that's been absorbing freezing temperatures all night, and the sensation is immediate and memorable. In summer, the warmth accelerates decomposition, and the aroma becomes assertive. Lime or ash sprinkled down the hole helps somewhat, and regular maintenance makes a significant difference. But no amount of care eliminates the fundamental reality that you're sitting above a pit of decomposing human waste. Insects are a constant companion. Flies are attracted to exactly what you'd expect them to be attracted to, and an outhouse in summer buzzes with activity. Spiders set up residence in corners, which is actually beneficial since they eat the flies, but knowing you're sharing intimate space with arachnids adds a certain thrill to the experience. Other creatures occasionally investigate, wasps building nests in sheltered eaves, mice exploring the structure, and in some regions, snakes seeking warm, protected spaces. The cautious outhouse user checks before sitting. Night visits to the outhouse are adventures in themselves. Remember that complete darkness we talked about earlier? Imagine navigating it while half asleep, crossing your yard in winter cold or summer mosquitoes, finding the outhouse door by memory and touch, and conducting your business without benefit of light unless you've brought a candle or lantern, which you might, but which also requires managing fire in a wooden structure full of dry paper. Many households keep a chamber pot specifically to avoid these nocturnal journeys, accepting the trade-off of emptying and cleaning the pot in the morning. Here's a quirky detail. Outhouses were often built to accommodate reading. The very fact that catalogues ended up in there suggests that people expected to spend some time, and the experience wasn't entirely unpleasant if conditions were favourable. On a nice autumn day, with fresh lime in the pit and no particular hurry, the outhouse could be a moment of actual solitude, rare in households where privacy was otherwise non-existent. Some families furnished their outhouses with small shelves for reading material, hooks for coats, even small windows to let in more light. The outhouse as an institution will persist well into the 20th century. Even as indoor plumbing spreads through American cities, rural areas and smaller communities will maintain their outhouses for decades. The Works Progress Administration during the Depression specifically built sanitary outhouses as public works projects, improving hygiene in communities that couldn't afford sewage systems. Your grandparents, or perhaps your great-grandparents, almost certainly had personal memories of outhouse life. It's closer to the present than it seems. Historians still argue about the health implications of the outhouse system. On one hand, privies concentrated waste away from living spaces, allowed for some decomposition before substances entered the environment, and represented a genuine improvement over even more casual disposal methods. On the other hand, they contaminated groundwater, attracted disease-carrying insects, and created obvious public health problems when scaled up to dense urban populations. The shift to sewage systems represented a genuine public health revolution, even if it created new problems of its own. What's striking from a modern perspective is how much mental energy the outhouse demanded. You had to plan around it. You developed timing strategies to minimize visits during unpleasant weather. You maintained the facility, or someone did, with regular additions of lime, occasional cleaning, and eventual relocation. The outhouse wasn't just a place you went. It was an ongoing project, a relationship you maintained because the alternative was worse. Chamber pots served as the indoor alternative, especially at night or during bad weather. These were ceramic or metal containers, kept under beds or in corners, used when the journey outside seemed too daunting. But chamber pots required emptying, usually into the outhouse pit, and cleaning, and storage, and discretion, and all the associated labour that came with managing bodily functions in close quarters. Nothing about human waste disposal in 1880 was simple, private, or free of effort. For the truly affluent, indoor plumbing was beginning to appear. Flush toilets existed and were becoming more common in wealthy urban homes. But these required water under pressure, sewer connections, and significant investment in both installation and maintenance. The vast majority of Americans, especially outside major cities, would wait decades for indoor bathrooms. You, in 1880, are probably making that trek to the backyard necessary. The outhouse door closes behind you, the creak announcing your departure as it announced your arrival. You return to the house, perhaps wash your hands, though standards of hand washing are not what they'll become, and prepare to continue your day. The outhouse will wait for your next visit, patient as always, ready to provide its particular service whenever nature calls. Speaking of services that require extraordinary effort, there's the question of what happens when children enter this equation. Because in 1880 America, children don't just exist in families, they work in them, often from ages that would horrify a modern child labour advocate. The children are awake now, if they weren't already. In your household, and in nearly every household across 1880 America, children are not the precious cargo to be protected, educated and entertained that they'll become in later generations. Children are workers, small workers certainly, workers with limited skills and attention spans, but workers nonetheless, essential contributors to the economic survival of the family unit. The concept of childhood as a protected period of development, learning and play is largely a luxury that most American families cannot afford. It exists in the abstract, in the speeches of reformers and the ideals of the educated middle class. But on farms, in tenements, in the countless households scraping by on insufficient income, children work because they must, and the question isn't whether they'll contribute labour, but how soon and in what capacity. A child's working life often begins around age 5 or 6, sometimes earlier. Tasks are age-appropriate in a relative sense. A 6-year-old isn't expected to plough fields, but they're still tasks. Small children gather eggs, feed chickens, chase crows away from crops, watch younger siblings, carry messages, fetch items, and perform the 1,000 small errands that a functioning household requires. Each contribution is minor. Together, they're essential. A child who isn't working is a child who's being carried by the labour of others. Farm children have particularly demanding lives. The agricultural calendar doesn't pause for youth, and planting and harvest seasons require every available hand. Children work alongside adults in fields, performing tasks suited to their size and strength, pulling weeds, picking crops, stacking hay, leading horses, carrying water to workers. The days are long, the sun is hot or the cold is bitter, and there's no option to decide you'd rather be doing something else. The farm requires labour and you provide it. In urban areas, children enter the industrial workforce in numbers that will later provoke reform movements and legislative action. Factories employ children for tasks that seem designed for small hands and small bodies: threading machines, cleaning under equipment, sorting small parts, operating machinery that an adult couldn't fit inside. The textile mills of New England are particularly notorious for child labour, employing children as young as 7 or 8 in conditions that would constitute criminal endangerment by modern standards. The coal mines present an even darker picture. Breaker boys sit for hours picking slate and debris from coal rushing past on conveyor belts, breathing coal dust, developing respiratory problems that will shorten their lives. Trap boys, even younger, sit in complete darkness, opening and closing ventilation doors. The danger is constant. Equipment that can maim or kill, darkness that hides hazards, air that slowly poisons young lungs. Yet families send their children to the mines because the income is necessary for survival. Historians still argue whether child labour was primarily exploitation or economic necessity, probably because it was both. Employers absolutely benefited from workers who could be paid pennies and who lacked the power to resist abuse. But families also needed the income their children could provide, and refusing to send a child to work might mean the difference between eating and starving. The morality of child labour is easier to judge from a position of prosperity than from within the grinding poverty that made it seem necessary. Education exists but competes directly with labour demands. Most states have compulsory education laws by 1880, but enforcement is spotty and exceptions are numerous. Rural schools operate seasonally, closing during planting and harvest when children are needed in fields. Urban schools try for year-round operation but struggle with attendance from families who need children's income. A child who attends school consistently is a child whose family can afford to lose that labour, which means school attendance is, in many ways, a class marker. The schoolhouse itself is a one-room affair in most communities, with a single teacher managing students of all ages, from beginning readers to teenagers preparing to leave education entirely. The older students help teach the younger ones, a practice that seems strange now but made practical sense when one adult faced 50 students of varying abilities. The curriculum is basic: reading, writing, arithmetic, and whatever moral instruction the community deems appropriate. Geography, history, and natural sciences appear as students advance, but the primary goal is literacy and numeracy sufficient for adult life. Discipline in schools and homes alike is physical. The rod, the switch, the belt, these are standard tools of child rearing. Spare the rod, spoil the child isn't just a saying, it's mainstream parenting philosophy. Corporal punishment is expected, accepted, and administered by parents, teachers, and other adults with authority over children. The idea that hitting children might be harmful to their development, that other disciplinary methods might be more effective, is a minority position that won't gain widespread acceptance for decades. Chores at home fill whatever time isn't devoted to formal work or school. Girls especially learn domestic skills through practice: cooking, cleaning, sewing, childcare. Boys learn whatever skills their fathers can teach: farming, trades, mechanical work. Gender roles are clear and early. There's little ambiguity about what adult life will require, and childhood is preparation for that life, not a separate stage with its own intrinsic value. Play happens, of course. Children are still children, and they find moments of joy and freedom in whatever gaps their lives provide. They play outside when they can, running, climbing, throwing things, engaging in the universal physical play that transcends era and culture. They make toys from available materials, dolls from rags, balls from yarn, guns from sticks. Manufactured toys exist for those who can afford them, but creativity and imagination supply what commerce cannot. Mortality among children is heartbreakingly high. Disease takes children with terrifying regularity. Diphtheria, measles, scarlet fever, whooping cough. These are genuine killers. especially for children under 5. Medical understanding is limited, treatments are often ineffective or harmful, and parents watch children die in numbers that would constitute a public health emergency today. Nearly every family has buried at least one child. Many have buried several. The emotional toll is impossible to calculate, and yet life continues because it must. Here's a detail that might strike modern readers as strange. Children's deaths are often marked with elaborate mourning rituals, but the expectation that some children will die is also simply accepted. Parents love their children, grieve when they die, but also understand that survival is never guaranteed. Some historians have argued that parents were emotionally reserved with young children because attachment made loss more painful. Others dispute this, noting evidence of deep bonds and devastating grief. The truth probably varies by family, by community, by individual capacity for love in the face of uncertainty. By adolescence, many children have essentially joined the adult world. Girls might be married by 15 or 16 in some communities. Boys might be working full-time, contributing primary income to families, or apprenticed to trades that will define their adult lives. The extended adolescence of modern Western society, those years between childhood and full adulthood devoted to education, exploration, and identity formation, doesn't exist in any meaningful sense. You grow up fast because circumstances demand it. The children around you now, whether yours, siblings, neighbourhood children, are already engaged in work. They've been up since you have, performing their morning tasks without complaint because complaint accomplishes nothing. They'll work through the day, receive what education they can, and go to sleep tired in ways that modern children rarely experience. Their childhood is brief, demanding, and oriented entirely toward becoming useful adults as quickly as possible. And speaking of unending work, somewhere in your household, someone is likely already preparing for one of the most dreaded days of the week. A day devoted entirely to a single task. A day of steam and labour and aching muscles. Laundry day. Monday. It's always Monday. Laundry day has been fixed on Monday for generations, and it will stay there until machines finally liberate humanity from this particular torment. Why Monday? Because Sunday is for church and rest, and the week's worth of dirty clothes needs addressing before the pile becomes completely unmanageable. Also because laundry takes so long that the clothes need all week to fully dry. Also because tradition is tradition, and questioning it doesn't get the washing done. You've been dreading this since yesterday. Everyone dreads laundry day except perhaps the very wealthy who employ others to dread it on their behalf. The process is so labour-intensive, so physically demanding, so utterly consuming of time and energy, that laundry day isn't an exaggeration. It's an accurate description. The entire day, from early morning to evening, will be devoted to getting clothes clean. The preparations began yesterday, actually. Water needed to be collected and stored, because laundry requires enormous quantities of it. Soap needed to be located, and soap in 1880 often means soap you've made yourself, boiled from lion animal fat, a process that's its own adventure in domestic chemistry. The copper or tin wash tub needed to be checked for leaks. The scrubbing board needed to be ready. The fire needed to be planned because you're going to be boiling water all day. The first step is sorting, which sounds simple enough but involves decisions that matter. White fabrics need the harshest treatment to maintain their whiteness. Coloured fabrics might run, especially newer items with unstable dyes. Heavily soiled work clothes need different handling than lightly worn undergarments. Wool requires gentler treatment than cotton. Silk, if you're fortunate enough to own any, barely gets washed at all because the risk of damage is too high. Every household develops its own sorting logic, passed down from mothers to daughters alongside the rest of domestic wisdom. The water goes on to boil first thing. You're heating large quantities, gallons and gallons, on your kitchen stove or over an outdoor fire, depending on the weather and your facilities. The steam fills the room, raising the temperature to uncomfortable levels. In summer, laundry day transforms your home into a sauna. In winter, the steam is almost welcome briefly. Soap shavings go into the hot water, creating the soapy bath where cleaning actually happens. Commercial laundry soap exists and is gradually replacing homemade versions. But it's still an expense that many families minimise through careful use. You don't waste soap, you use just enough to get the job done and save the rest for next week. Now comes the scrubbing. This is the labour that defines laundry day, the part that turns arms into aching masses of protesting muscle. Each garment goes onto the scrubbing board, a corrugated metal or wood surface that provides friction, and gets worked up and down, up and down, the fabric rubbed against the ridges to loosen dirt. Collars and cuffs get special attention. Stains get targeted scrubbing. Particularly dirty items might need repeated treatment. The physical toll is real. Women who do laundry regularly develop distinctive musculature. Strong forearms, strong shoulders, the kind of physical conditioning that comes from specific repeated movements. They also develop skin problems from constant exposure to lye-based soap and hot water. Red, cracked, painful hands are the mark of someone who does their own washing. Wealthier women's smooth hands advertise their freedom from this particular labour. After scrubbing comes rinsing. More water, this time clean, to remove the soap from the fabric. The water has to be changed multiple times as it becomes saturated with soap. Rinse water often gets recycled for less delicate items, because hauling water is labour and waste is sin. The rinsing process adds hours to the day, hours of lifting wet fabric, wringing it out, immersing it again, wringing again. Wringing deserves its own mention because wringing is exhausting. Wet fabric is heavy, very heavy. You twist and squeeze, trying to extract as much water as possible because wet clothes take forever to dry. Your hands cramp, your wrists ache. The water drips onto you, onto the floor, onto everything nearby. And when you think you've wrung the garment as dry as possible, you do it again because every drop of water removed is time saved in drying. Some households have wringers, devices with two rollers that you crank while feeding wet fabric through, mechanically squeezing out water. These are minor miracles of labour-saving technology, the washing machine of their day. If you have one, you're grateful. If you don't, you're wringing by hand and probably thinking about whether you can afford one. The wrung items go onto lines to dry, clotheslines strung across yards, between buildings, wherever there's space and air circulation. In good weather, sun and breeze can dry clothes in hours. In bad weather, you're drying inside, hanging things near the stove, draping them over every available surface, and waiting days for them to fully dry. The entire house smells of damp fabric. Humidity rises. Nothing feels quite comfortable until the laundry is finally dry and put away. Here's a quirky detail about 1880s laundry, bluing. This is a product you add to rinse water for white fabrics, a blue dye that counteracts the yellow tinge that white cotton develops with age and repeated washing. It sounds counterintuitive. Why add blue to make something white? But it works through colour theory, the blue cancelling out the yellow, to produce the illusion of brighter white. Bluing remains available today for the same purpose, one of many laundry products that bridge the centuries. Historians still argue about how much time laundry actually consumed, and whether accounts of full-day labour are exaggerations. Detailed time studies suggest they're not. A family's weekly wash, done thoroughly by 1 or 2 workers, realistically takes 8 to 10 hours of active labour. Add prep time, drying time, and the folding and putting away that follows, and laundry truly does consume most of Monday and spill into Tuesday. Ironing comes later in the week, usually Tuesday, once things are fully dry. The irons are solid metal, heated on the stove, rotated in sequence so there's always a hot one ready while others reheat. Ironing is also labour-intensive, also produces heat that makes rooms uncomfortable, also takes hours to complete. Ironed clothes are expected for church and for public presentation. Wrinkled clothes mark you as either poor or careless, neither of which is socially acceptable. By the time laundry day ends, you're exhausted in a way that transcends normal tired. Your back aches from bending over tubs, your arms are weak from scrubbing and wringing, your hands might be raw from the soap. And you know, even as you collapse into whatever rest evening provides, that next Monday will bring the same ordeal. And the Monday after that, and every Monday until someone invents a better way, or you die, whichever comes first. The modern washing machine, when it arrives in homes across America in the 20th century, will represent one of the most significant quality of life improvements in human history. Time studies show that mechanised laundry saves roughly 4 hours per week per household. That's 4 hours not spent in exhausting physical labour, 4 hours available for other purposes, 4 hours of life returned that had been claimed by the washing. But that's the future. Right now it's still 1880, and the laundry is your problem, just like the cooking, which we should probably talk about next, because if laundry is the dreaded weekly marathon, cooking is the daily grind that never, ever ends. The kitchen stove dominates the space it occupies, a cast-iron beast that radiates heat whether you want it to or not. Cooking in 1880. America isn't a hobby or a creative outlet or something you do when the mood strikes. It's a fundamental survival activity that demands attention multiple times each day, every day, with no breaks for vacation and no option to order takeout when you don't feel like dealing with it. Your stove is probably a cast iron wood burner, though coal stoves are increasingly common, especially in urban areas where wood is expensive. Either way, the basic principle is the same. You're managing fire constantly, adjusting the heat by adding or removing fuel, opening or closing dampers, developing an intuition for temperature that modern cooks with their precise digital thermometers would find bewildering. There are no numbers on this stove, no settings to select. There is only the fire and your relationship with it. Starting the stove requires the same fire-building skills that warm your house. Kindling, wood, patience, coaxing flames from reluctant materials. The stove might have been banked overnight, the coals covered with ash to slow their burning, but it still needs attention each morning to bring it back to cooking temperature. You become expert at reading the fire, knowing by subtle signs whether it's too hot or too cool for what you're planning to make. The heat is relentless. In winter, this is almost welcome. The cooking stove supplements your heating stove, and the warmth radiating from the kitchen makes that room the most comfortable in the house. In summer, cooking becomes a form of punishment. The stove still needs to run, you still need to eat, but standing over an open flame in July or August, in a kitchen that might reach well over 100 degrees, is genuinely brutal. Some families shift to cold meals during the hottest months, or cook outside over open fires to avoid heating the house. Meal planning is dictated by preservation and availability rather than preference. You cook what you have, what's in season, what hasn't spoiled. The root cellar holds potatoes, carrots, turnips, onions, vegetables that keep through winter without refrigeration. The smokehouse holds preserved meat. The pantry holds flour, cornmeal, dried beans, rice, and other staples that remain edible for extended periods. Fresh meat is available immediately after slaughter or purchase, but without refrigeration, it needs to be cooked quickly or preserved. Breakfast you've already experienced. Dinner, the midday meal, the largest of the day, is where the real cooking happens. Supper, the evening meal, is typically lighter, often consisting of leftovers from dinner or simple preparations that don't require extensive stove time. This meal pattern makes sense when you consider the labour involved. Concentrating cooking effort in one major session is more efficient than heating the stove fully multiple times daily. The recipes you know aren't written down, or at least not with the precision modern cooks expect. Measurements are approximate. A handful of this, a pinch of that, enough flour to make a soft dough. Cooking times are estimated, bake until golden, simmer until tender. You've learned to cook the same way generations before you learned, by watching, by helping, by gradually taking over tasks as your skills developed. The body knows things that the mind hasn't formalized, how bread dough should feel, how simmering sounds different from boiling when a roast is done. Common dishes are simple by necessity. Stews and soups stretch small amounts of meat with vegetables and grains. Cornbread appears at nearly every meal, quick to make and cheap to produce. Beans, cooked in vast quantities, provide protein when meat is scarce. Porridge and mush fill bellies economically. The elaborate multi-course meals of the wealthy are fantasy for most families. Everyday cooking is about sustenance rather than elegance. Here's a detail that might surprise you. Seasoning is often minimal. Salt is essential and relatively available. Pepper is a trade good, more expensive than salt but present in most kitchens. Beyond those, spices are luxuries that depend on income and location. Some regions have strong traditions of particular seasonings, the Germans with their caraway, the Mexicans with their chilies, but the average American meal relies heavily on salt and cooking technique rather than complex spice blends. Baking bread is a particular skill that every cook must master. Commercial bakeries serve urban areas, but rural families and many urban poor produce their own bread. This means managing yeast, either commercial yeast if you can afford it, or wild yeast captured from the environment in sourdough starters. Bread dough needs to rise, which requires warmth that might be hard to maintain in a cold kitchen. The timing of bread baking interweaves with other kitchen tasks, requiring attention across hours rather than minutes. The labour of kitchen work is predominantly women's labour, though this varies by household and necessity. Women prepare meals, preserve food, manage supplies, and clean up afterward. Girls learn kitchen skills from early ages, gradually assuming more responsibility until they can manage a household's food needs independently. The kitchen is a woman's domain in the ideology of the era, and escaping it requires either wealth, circumstance, or deliberate rebellion against social expectations. Historians still argue about the actual nutritional quality of 1880s American diets. By modern standards, they were often deficient, lacking fresh vegetables during winter months, lacking variety, sometimes lacking sufficient calories during hard times. But they were also free of many problems that would emerge later. Highly processed foods, added sugars in everything, the empty calories of modern convenience eating. People ate what was available, prepared simply, and worked it off through physical labour. Food preservation is a significant portion of household labour that happens outside daily meal preparation. Summer and fall are canning season, when vegetables and fruits are processed and sealed in jars for winter consumption. Meat is smoked, salted, or dried. Eggs are preserved in various ways. Water glass, a sodium silicate solution, being one popular method. The goal is to capture summer's abundance and distribute it across winter's scarcity, turning the brief growing season into year-round sustenance. Burns are an occupational hazard of cooking. The stove is hot, the pots are hot, the oven is hot. Forearms bear scars from brushing against heated metal. Hands get splashed with hot grease or boiling water. Medical treatment for burns is limited to home remedies of varying effectiveness, and minor burns are simply part of the cooking life. More serious burns, and they happen, can be debilitating or fatal without modern medical intervention. The day's cooking never truly ends. You finish one meal and begin preparing for the next. Leftovers need to be stored or transformed into tomorrow's meals. The stove needs to be tended. Dishes need washing, more water, more labour. The kitchen is a workspace that demands constant attention, and the person responsible for it is never fully off duty. Even at night, bread might be rising, beans might be soaking, a banked fire might need checking. You've become accustomed to the rhythm of it, the way cooking structures the day around meals that mark morning, midday, evening. The work is hard, but there's satisfaction in feeding people, in producing something necessary and even enjoyable from raw materials. Still, on days when you're tired, when the heat is oppressive, when the meal doesn't turn out right, you might dream of some future where cooking is easier, faster, less consuming of your time and energy. That future will come, but not for decades. Right now, there's dinner to prepare and the stove is waiting. Speaking of waiting, there's another dimension to daily life we should explore. The dimension of acquiring the things you cook and consume. Because shopping in 1880 doesn't mean a quick trip to the supermarket. The market is a sensory experience that modern retail has spent a century trying to sanitize away. There are no climate-controlled aisles here, no background music, no carefully designed layouts meant to maximize your spending. What you have instead is something rawer, more immediate, more connected to the actual business of producing and exchanging goods. If you're in a town of any size, shopping means visiting multiple vendors for different categories of items. There's no single store that sells everything. That concept won't fully develop until Sears convinces America that you can buy your entire life from a catalogue. And even then, local merchants will remain essential for daily needs. Instead, you visit the butcher for meat, the baker for bread if you're not baking your own, the general store for dry goods and sundries, and perhaps specialised shops for fabric, hardware, medicines, and other particular needs. The general store is the closest thing to a one-stop shop, and it's a wonder of densely packed merchandise. Barrels of flour, sugar, and pickles crowd the floor. Shelves hold everything from bolts of cloth to patent medicines to kerosene for your lamps. The ceiling is hung with pots, harnesses, tools. The counter displays candies for children and tobacco products for adults. The smell is complex, leather and spices and cheese and coffee, and the particular mustiness of goods that have travelled long distances to reach this spot. You don't simply select items and bring them to a register. Shopping is a social transaction, a negotiation, a relationship between you and the merchant. Prices are often flexible, especially for regular customers. Quality is assessed personally. You might ask the grocer to open a barrel so you can examine the flour inside, checking for weevils or staleness. Goods are often sold loose, scooped from containers into whatever you've brought to carry them, because standardized packaging is expensive and not yet universal. Credit is essential for many families. Cash flow in agricultural communities is seasonal. You have money after harvest, less money during planting, and very little money in winter. Merchants extend credit to regular customers, tracking purchases in ledger books and settling accounts when funds are available. This system creates relationships that bind communities together, but also creates opportunities for dispute, exploitation, and the slow accumulation of debt that can trap families in financial difficulty. The quality of goods varies enormously and unpredictably. Food adulteration is rampant and largely unregulated. That coffee you bought might be stretched with chicory, roasted grains, or even sawdust. The pepper might be mixed with ground coconut shells. The milk might be watered down, then thickened with chalk or flour to disguise the dilution. The butter might contain more lard than butterfat. Merchants might not even know what they're selling has been adulterated, as the cheating often happens further up the supply chain. Historians still argue about how widespread and harmful food adulteration actually was in this era. Consumer protection advocates of the time certainly portrayed it as an epidemic, and their accounts drove eventual regulation. But determining actual rates of adulteration from historical evidence is difficult, and some claims were likely exaggerated for political effect. What's clear is that buyers had reason to be cautious, and that trust in merchants mattered enormously. Here's a quirky detail about 1880s shopping. The Cracker Barrel really existed and really was where crackers came from. Soda crackers, hardtack and other dry goods came in barrels that sat open in stores, available for customers to sample or purchase by weight. The image of old men sitting around the Cracker Barrel at the general store, gossiping and opining, reflects actual social practice. The general store was a community gathering place, especially in rural areas where other social venues were limited. Fresh produce depends entirely on season and location. In summer and fall, local farmers bring vegetables, fruits and eggs to market. You might buy from a wagon at a designated market day, or from a farmer who makes regular rounds through town, or from your own garden if you're fortunate enough to have one. The variety is determined by what grows locally. No tropical fruits, no vegetables from distant climates, nothing that can't survive the journey from field to table without refrigeration. The arrival of the railroad has begun changing this equation. Trains can move perishable goods faster than any previous transportation, extending the range of products available to communities along rail lines. Oranges from Florida or California might actually appear in northern markets, still edible if handled quickly. This is the beginning of the national food distribution system that will eventually bring year-round variety to American tables, but in 1880 it's still a novelty rather than a standard expectation. Prices fluctuate with supply, season and circumstance. A good harvest means cheaper grain. A bad one means high prices that might push families toward hunger. Seasonal availability means paying premium prices for items out of their natural abundance. Economic conditions nationally and locally affect what merchants can charge and what customers can afford. The stable, predictable prices of modern retail don't exist. Shopping requires constant attention to value and opportunity. For items beyond daily food and household goods, you might order from catalogues. Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck are revolutionizing retail by offering vast selections of merchandise delivered by mail. You page through thick catalogues, hundreds of pages of clothing, tools, furniture, musical instruments, patent medicines, and almost anything else you might want, and place orders that arrive weeks later by train and wagon. The catalogue democratizes consumption, bringing city goods to rural customers who might never visit a department store in person. The waiting for catalogue orders requires patience that modern two-day shipping has largely eliminated. You order something, and then you wait. Weeks pass. You check with the post office or the express office. Eventually a package arrives, and you hope it's what you expected because returning items is complicated, expensive, and not always possible. But the access to merchandise, the ability to buy things you couldn't otherwise obtain, makes the wait worthwhile for many families. Payment presents its own complexities. Currency exists in multiple forms: gold and silver coins, paper currency of varying reliability, and local substitutes in some areas. Banks are not universal, and checks are not yet standard for retail transactions. You pay cash when you have it, credit when you don't, and barter when neither works. Farmers might pay in kind, trading bushels of grain or cords of wood for the goods they need. Flexibility is essential. The shopping experience is time-consuming in ways that would frustrate modern consumers. Trips to town might take hours by wagon on poor roads. Once there, you visit multiple merchants, transact multiple times, perhaps wait while items are weighed, measured, or located. Carrying purchases home requires planning. Heavy items, fragile items, items that might spoil need management. A major shopping expedition is a significant project, not a quick errand. And yet there's something in the market experience that modern shopping has lost. The personal connection with merchants, the social aspect of commerce, the sensory richness of products encountered in their unpackaged state. Shopping is slower, more laborious, but also more embedded in community life, more tied to relationships that extend beyond single transactions. But the reality of 1880s America is that no matter how efficiently you shop, no matter how carefully you manage household supplies, illness will find you. And when it does, the medical care available makes modern emergency rooms look like science fiction. You feel it coming, that scratch at the back of your throat, the heaviness in your limbs, the creeping sense that your body is about to betray you. In your world, the modern world, this would mean a trip to the pharmacy for over-the-counter remedies, maybe a visit to the doctor if symptoms persist, almost certainly a recovery within a week or two. In 1880 America, it means something far less certain. Medicine in this era operates with confidence that dramatically exceeds its actual capabilities. Doctors speak authoritatively about treatments that range from ineffective to actively harmful. Medical schools vary wildly in quality, and many practicing physicians have minimal formal education. A few years of lecture attendance, perhaps some observation, and a willingness to present themselves as experts. The germ theory of disease is gaining acceptance in advanced medical circles, but it hasn't yet transformed everyday practice. Many doctors still believe illness results from miasma, bad air, or imbalances in bodily humours, theories that lead to treatments that make patients worse, not better. The medicines available are a mix of the genuinely useful, the harmless, and the dangerous. Patent medicines fill pharmacy shelves, bottles of liquid promising to cure everything from tuberculosis to female complaints to childhood fussiness. These nostrums typically contain alcohol, often in significant quantities, mixed with various flavourings and sometimes with more concerning ingredients. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, is freely available for pain relief, cough suppression, and calming fussy infants. Cocaine appears in medicines and tonics, marketed as energising and therapeutic. Mercury compounds are prescribed for multiple conditions despite their obvious toxicity. The doctor who visits your home, house calls being standard practice, carries a medical bag containing instruments and remedies that reflect the state of the art. He might take your pulse, examine your tongue, ask about your symptoms, and then prescribe treatment based on theory and tradition rather than controlled evidence. Bleeding, actually draining blood from patients, persists as a treatment for some conditions, despite mounting evidence that it weakens rather than heals. Purging through powerful laxatives and emetics remains common, the logic being that illness should be expelled from the body by any means available. Surgical procedures are possible but terrifying. Anesthesia exists, ether and chloroform are used to render patients unconscious, but antiseptic technique is inconsistent. Joseph Lister's ideas about carbolic acid and sterile procedures have been published but aren't universally adopted. Surgery might happen on your kitchen table, performed by a physician who washed his hands or didn't depending on his personal beliefs about contamination. Survival depends on luck as much as skill. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of 19th century medicine compared to simply doing nothing. Some studies suggest that on average, patients who received medical treatment fared no better than those who relied on rest, nutrition and time, and in some cases medical intervention actively reduced survival rates. This isn't an indictment of individual physicians, many of whom were sincere and dedicated, but of the state of medical knowledge, which simply hadn't developed the tools and understanding that would make intervention reliably helpful. Childhood diseases that modern vaccines have nearly eliminated are constant threats. Diphtheria closes children's throats, suffocating them slowly unless they're lucky. Scarlet fever sweeps through communities, leaving death and deafness in its wake. Measles, whooping cough, typhoid fever, each takes its toll on children and adults alike. When a disease enters your community, you wait to see who will sicken, who will recover, who will die. There's little to do but watch and hope. Here's a quirky detail about 1880s medicine. Leeches are still in use, not as commonly as a generation earlier, but bloodletting via leeches hasn't entirely disappeared. The little creatures are applied to specific locations to draw blood locally, supposedly treating inflammation and other conditions. They don't help generally, but they've been used for centuries, and tradition dies hard. Some modern medical applications have actually brought leeches back for specific purposes, though not the general bloodletting of the 19th century. Dental care deserves special mention because toothaches might be the most common medical complaint of the era. There are no fluoridated water supplies, limited understanding of dental hygiene, and diets that include plenty of sugar in various forms. Teeth decay, abscess, ache, and eventually need extraction. A dentist, if you have access to one, can pull teeth, fill cavities with gold or amalgam, and perhaps fit false teeth if enough originals are gone. The procedures are painful even with the primitive anaesthetics available, and dental problems that go untreated can become life-threatening infections. Women's health is a particular area of medical ignorance and interference. Female complaints cover a range of conditions from menstrual problems to pregnancy complications to mental health issues, all treated with similar lack of understanding. Pregnancy and childbirth remain genuinely dangerous. Maternal mortality rates that would be considered catastrophic today are simply normal. The moment of highest risk for any woman is the moment of giving birth, when bleeding, infection, and complications can quickly become fatal. Mental illness is handled with approaches that mix cruelty with sincere but misguided attempts at treatment. Asylums exist for those deemed unmanageable, but the line between mental illness, social nonconformity, and simple inconvenience to family is blurry. Women can be committed for conditions as vague as melancholy or nervousness. Treatment within asylums ranges from humane custodial care to restraints, cold baths, and other therapies that amount to punishment. Understanding of mental illness as illness rather than moral failing is only beginning to develop. The cost of medical care adds another dimension to suffering. Doctors charge for visits, and their fees might be affordable or might represent a significant financial burden depending on your circumstances. Extended illness can destroy a family's finances, consuming savings and pushing households into debt. There's no health insurance in the modern sense, no social safety net to catch those who can't afford care. You pay, you depend on charity, or you do without. Home remedies fill the gap when professional care is unavailable or unaffordable. Every household has its collection of treatments, passed down through generations. Mustard plasters for chest complaints, willow bark tea for fever, which actually works. It contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin, various herbal preparations of varying effectiveness. Women, especially older women, often serve as informal medical advisors within their communities, dispensing wisdom about childbirth, childhood illness, and common complaints. This folk medicine tradition sometimes produces genuinely helpful treatments and sometimes causes harm, but it's what many families rely on when doctors are distant or expensive. Death from illness is common enough that dying at home, surrounded by family, is the normal expectation. Hospitals exist primarily in cities, serving those without families to care for them, and often carrying stigma as places for the poor. Respectable people die in their own beds, attended by relatives and perhaps a physician, who can do little more than provide comfort. The deathbed scene, common in literature and art of the era, reflects real practice. You gather, you wait, you say goodbye. The prevalence of death leads us to something you cannot avoid in 1880s America: the constant presence of mortality, the rituals that surround it, the ways that loss shapes everyday life. Death lives in the room next door, in the empty chair at the table, in the small graves behind the church. You know death personally, have probably held its hand, have almost certainly watched it take someone you loved. In 1880 America, mortality is not an abstraction that happens in hospitals and nursing homes, hidden from daily life. It's present, visible, acknowledged, and woven into the fabric of ordinary existence. The statistics are numbing when reduced to numbers. Infant mortality hovers around 15 to 20%. Roughly 1 in 6 children born alive does not survive to their first birthday. Child mortality overall means that reaching adulthood is a genuine accomplishment, not an expectation. Average life expectancy is somewhere in the low 40s, though this number is skewed by the high death rates among children. Those who survive to adulthood often live considerably longer. Still, dying at 50 or 60 is common, and reaching 75 is remarkable enough to warrant community respect. These numbers translate into lived experience of loss that modern people rarely encounter. Nearly every family has buried at least one child. Many have buried several. Parents attend the funerals of children. Children attend the funerals of siblings. and the grief that accompanies these losses is simply part of ordinary life. You develop coping mechanisms, faith, community, work, because the alternative is paralysis. Death arrives in many forms. Disease takes children and weakened adults with terrible regularity. Accidents, farming accidents, industrial accidents, transportation accidents, claim workers and bystanders. Violence, while often exaggerated in historical memory, certainly happens. Childbirth kills mothers, and time simply runs out for the elderly, who fade in ways that are accepted as natural even when deeply mourned. When death comes, it comes to the home. The dying person remains in their bedroom, tended by family, visited by neighbours and clergy, declining by degrees that everyone can observe. The moment of death happens in the presence of loved ones if possible, a final gathering, a chance to say goodbye, to receive last words, to witness the transition from living to deceased. This is considered a good death, a proper death, and families go to considerable lengths to ensure the dying are not alone. The body is prepared at home, typically by family members with help from neighbours experienced in the task. Women wash and dress the corpse, arrange hair and features, do their best to create a peaceful appearance. The body is laid out, often in the parlour, the formal front room of the house, for viewing. The parlour becomes so associated with death in American homes that the industry will eventually rebrand it as the living room, specifically to escape morbid connotations. Mourning rituals are elaborate and strictly observed. Bereaved family members wear specific clothing, black for deep mourning, transitioning through greys and purple as the mourning period progresses. The duration of mourning varies by relationship. Widows might wear black for years, while more distant relatives observe shorter periods. Mourning jewellery is popular, often containing hair from the deceased, a way of keeping part of the loved one physically present. The house might be draped with black crepe, and social activities are curtailed according to established etiquette. Here's a detail that might strike modern readers as macabre. Post-mortem photography is common and valued. Families who couldn't afford or didn't think to have photographs taken during a person's life would have photographs taken after death. The body arranged to look as peaceful and lifelike as possible, sometimes posed with living family members, sometimes positioned to appear merely asleep. These photographs are treasured, displayed, kept for generations. They represent the only visual record some families have of lost loved ones. Funerals are community events, well attended and socially significant. The deceased's worth is measured partly by the turnout. A large funeral indicates a respected member of the community. The service typically happens in the home or a church, officiated by clergy, and includes hymns, prayers and eulogies. Then comes the procession to the cemetery, walking or riding, with formal attention to order and propriety. Burial happens the same day or the next, before the body can deteriorate beyond what embalming techniques of the era can manage. Embalming is becoming more common, especially after the Civil War demonstrated its usefulness for returning soldiers' bodies to distant families. The process involves draining blood and replacing it with preservative chemicals, slowing decomposition enough for viewing and transportation. Not everyone is embalmed, it's an added expense, and many families proceed without it, but the practice is spreading, professionalizing death handling and gradually shifting it from the domain of family and community to the domain of specialists. Cemeteries are changing character during this period. The rural cemetery movement, which began earlier in the century, has created park-like burial grounds designed for visiting and contemplation. Lawns, trees, winding paths, ornate monuments. These replace the stark churchyard graveyards of earlier generations, offering more pleasant spaces for the living to commune with the dead. Visiting the graves of loved ones is a regular social practice, and cemeteries serve as public parks in communities that lack other green spaces. Historians still argue about whether the elaborate mourning rituals of the Victorian era reflected genuine grief or social performance. Probably both, in varying proportions depending on the individual. Grief is real, universally human, but its expression is always shaped by cultural expectations. The specific forms mourning took in 1880, America, the clothing, the duration, the rituals, were inherited from English Victorian practice and adapted to American circumstances. Children encounter death directly and repeatedly. They attend funerals, view bodies, participate in mourning. The attempt to shield children from awareness of death that characterizes later American culture doesn't exist. partly because shielding them would be impossible given death's prevalence, partly because death is understood as natural rather than traumatic, something children should learn to accept as part of life. Whether this early exposure to mortality was psychologically beneficial, harmful, or neutral remains debated. The cemetery itself might be close by, within walking distance, part of the landscape you navigate regularly. You pass the graves of relatives, neighbours, community members. The stones tell abbreviated stories, names, dates, relationships, sometimes brief epitaphs. You learn to read the stones, to note the frequency of dates clustered in certain years, epidemic years, when disease swept through and left multiple graves in its wake. Spiritualism offers comfort to some grieving families. The idea that communication with the dead remains possible, that loved ones aren't truly gone but merely relocated to another plane of existence. Seances, mediums, spirit photography. These attract substantial followings, offering the hope that death is not an ending but a transition. The movement has charlatans and sincere believers mixed together, and deciding which is not always possible. Living with constant awareness of mortality shapes how you think about the future. You don't assume you'll live to old age because too many people don't. You appreciate what you have because you've seen it taken from others. You might be more fatalistic than modern people, more accepting that some things are beyond human control. Or you might rage against death, fight it with every available resource, refuse to accept its inevitability. Both responses exist, as they always have, but life continues despite death, or perhaps because of it. And one way life continues, even in 1880, is through entertainment. The moments of joy, connection, and escape that punctuate the hard work and heavy grief. The workday is winding down, or at least the hardest parts of it, and there's a moment, maybe an hour, maybe less, when you can rest. The fire is banked, the animals are fed, the children are relatively contained, and the endless list of tasks that defines your existence pauses briefly. This is when entertainment happens, squeezed into the margins of a life that doesn't leave much room for leisure. You make your own fun. This is literally true in ways that modern people, with their streaming services and infinite content options, can barely imagine. There is no television, no radio, no internet. There are no movie theatres. There are no professional sports leagues broadcasting games into your home. The entertainment that exists in your life either happens in person, in your community, or you create it yourself. Music fills many of these quiet evening hours. Somebody in your household probably plays an instrument, a fiddle, a banjo, a guitar, a piano if you're fortunate enough to own one. Music is not a recorded commodity you consume. It's a live experience created by people you know. Families gather around the parlour piano and sing together, harmonising on hymns and popular songs everyone knows. The ability to play an instrument is a valued social skill, something you might specifically cultivate in yourself or your children. The songs you know are passed down orally, or learned from sheet music purchased from catalogues or shops. Beautiful Dreamer, Camptown Races, Listen to the Mockingbird. The popular songs of the era are sentimental, melodic, designed for amateur performance in parlours exactly like yours. Nobody expects professional quality music. The point is participation, togetherness, the shared experience of making sound together. Storytelling and reading aloud occupy other evenings. If your household is literate, and most American households in 1880 have at least one literate member, books are precious commodities, passed around families and communities, read aloud for the benefit of those who can't read themselves, or who simply enjoy hearing stories spoken. Novels by Dickens, romances, adventure stories, inspirational tales. Literature is consumed communally, discussed, debated. Here's a detail that might surprise you. Parlour games are hugely popular and varied. We tend to think of charades as the quintessential Victorian game, but there are dozens more. Word games, guessing games, observation games, games that involve movement and performance. Cards are played constantly, though some religious households disapprove and substitute other games. Dominoes, chess, checkers, and various proprietary board games exist for those who can afford them. These games aren't just for children. Adults play enthusiastically, welcoming structured entertainment that requires no external resources. The occasional dance represents a social highlight that some families anticipate for weeks. Community dances bring people together in barns, meeting halls, or wherever space allows. A local band or just a fiddler provides the music. Couples whirl through reels, quadrilles, waltzes. formal dances with specific steps that everyone learns as part of their social education. The dance is opportunity for courtship, community bonding, physical exertion that feels like joy rather than labour. Lectures and performances visit communities large enough to attract them. The Chautauqua movement is bringing educational entertainment to small-town America. Travelling speakers, musicians and performers who set up tents and offer programs combining enlightenment with amusement. You might hear a talk on scientific discoveries, a dramatic reading from Shakespeare, a political oration, and musical performances all in the same visit. These events are genuine highlights of community life, anticipated and remembered. Circuses and travelling shows provide spectacle on a scale that nothing else matches. The circus is coming to town, and the entire community turns out to watch elephants parade down Main Street, to marvel at acrobats and clowns and strange creatures from distant lands. The travelling medicine show brings entertainment alongside its dubious products. Singers, comedians, acts designed to gather crowds that might then be sold cure-all tonics. These shows are often ethically questionable but undeniably entertaining. Holidays concentrate entertainment into specific occasions. Christmas is becoming the gift-giving, decoration-hanging extravaganza that modern Americans would recognise, though the celebration is still developing toward its eventual form. The 4th of July brings picnics, parades, fireworks, political speeches, and day-long community gatherings. Local holidays, harvest festivals, founders' days, various ethnic celebrations provide additional opportunities for communal joy. Historians still argue about how much genuine leisure-time working-class Americans actually had in this era. The accounts vary widely depending on occupation, region, and circumstances. Some workers had virtually no leisure, their waking hours completely consumed by labour. Others, particularly in seasonal occupations, had considerable downtime during slow periods. The concept of the weekend as dedicated leisure time doesn't exist yet. Saturday is typically a work day, but even the hardest workers found moments for entertainment. Drinking is, unfortunately, a significant recreational activity for many Americans. The temperance movement is growing in strength, pointing to the genuine social problems caused by excessive alcohol consumption, family violence, poverty, neglected responsibilities, but drinking remains deeply embedded in social life. Saloons serve as community gathering places for men, offering not just alcohol but conversation, news, sometimes music, sometimes gambling. The temperance advocates aren't wrong about alcohol's harms, but they're fighting against social patterns that will take decades to change. Sports exist, but not yet in their modern, organised forms. Baseball is becoming America's pastime, with professional leagues forming and local teams playing in communities across the country. But most sports are played informally, games organised on the spot, rules negotiated between players, equipment improvised from available materials. Children play constantly when released from work, their games evolving from generation to generation. Reading for individual pleasure, not reading aloud, but silent reading alone, is increasingly common as literacy spreads and printed matter becomes cheaper. Newspapers arrive daily or weekly depending on your location, bringing news of the wider world and local gossip alike. Magazines offer serialized fiction, practical advice, and glimpses of lives different from your own. Dime novels, cheap, exciting, often poorly written adventure stories, provide escapism for readers who might never experience the Wild West or the high seas firsthand. The evening winds down, entertainment gives way to drowsiness, and the fire burns lower. Tomorrow will bring more work, more obligations, more of the endless tasks that make up a life in 1880 America. But for now, in these few hours between work and sleep, there's been music or stories or games, or simply quiet conversation with people you love. These moments matter. They're what make the labour bearable, the hardships survivable. They're what you'll remember when everything else fades. But before bed, there's Sunday to consider. The day that structures your week, that determines your social standing, that connects you to community and to something larger than yourself. The Sunday bell is calling, and whether you want to answer or not isn't really the question. In 1880, America, church attendance isn't optional in the way it might become later. It's a social expectation that shapes community life, determines your standing with neighbours, and provides one of the few reliable breaks. In the relentless rhythm of work, you've dressed in your best clothes, which might not be saying much. The Sunday outfit is reserved specifically for this purpose. nicer fabric, cleaner condition, more carefully maintained than everyday wear. Appearances matter in church, and your presence in the pew communicates something about your character, your family, your commitment to the values that your community claims to hold dear. Showing up poorly dressed is almost as bad as not showing up at all. The church itself might be a grand stone structure if you're in an established urban area, or a simple wooden building if you're in a newer community, or nothing more than a meeting hall temporarily converted for services. The architecture reflects the resources and age of the congregation, but the function is the same everywhere, gathering people together under shared belief, shared ritual, shared submission to something beyond themselves. The service is long. Modern churchgoers who fidget after an hour would find themselves tested by services that commonly run 2, 3, even 4 hours. There are prayers, readings, hymns sung from hymnals that everyone knows by heart, and sermons that explore theological points at length that seems almost academic. The preacher might be educated and eloquent, or might be a farmer called to ministry with more passion than Polish. Either way, you listen, or at least you appear to listen, because attentiveness is part of the performance. Here's a quirky detail about 1880s church attendance. Pew rental is common. Many churches finance themselves partly through selling or renting specific pews to families, who then occupy those spots weekly, year after year, generation after generation. Your pew location announces your social position. Prominent families sit near the front, less prominent families further back, and the truly poor might stand or sit on benches at the very rear. The practice is controversial even in its own time, with some churches rejecting it as contrary to Christian equality, but it persists nonetheless. The theological landscape of 1880 America is diverse and sometimes contentious. Mainline Protestant denominations dominate most communities: Methodists, Baptists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Congregationalists. But Roman Catholics are numerous, especially in cities with immigrant populations. Jews, though a small minority, maintain communities in urban centres. Smaller groups proliferate: Quakers, Unitarians, various evangelical movements, new religious movements that emerge from the spiritual ferment of the era. America has no official church, but Christianity shapes public life in ways that would seem extraordinary to later generations. The sermon likely addresses itself to concerns both spiritual and practical. Preachers are community leaders who speak to issues of the day, economic conditions, political questions, moral concerns, alongside eternal matters of salvation and damnation. The content varies enormously depending on denomination and individual minister. Some preachers offer comfort and assurance, others threaten hellfire with vivid intensity. The idea of fire and brimstone preaching isn't metaphorical. Some sermons describe eternal torment in genuinely disturbing detail. Women and men often sit separately, though this varies by denomination and region. Children attend with families but are expected to sit quietly through services that take no account of their shorter attention spans. Sunday school provides religious education for children before or after the main service, teaching Bible stories, moral lessons, and the catechism of whatever denomination hosts the class. Historians still argue about the actual religiosity of 19th century Americans, whether widespread church attendance reflected genuine belief or merely social conformity. Probably both, as with most human institutions. Some people clearly found deep meaning and comfort in their faith. Others attended because absence would be noticed and judged. The distinction between sincere belief and cultural Christianity is as hard to draw in 1880 as in any era. After the service comes the social dimension that makes church attendance as much about community as about religion. People linger outside the building, catching up on news, discussing the sermon, making plans for the coming week. This is where courtships advance, where business is discussed, where gossip spreads. For women especially, whose social lives are more constrained than men's, church provides essential connection to the world beyond their households. The Sunday dinner follows church, typically the most elaborate meal of the week. This is when families pull out whatever special foods they've been saving: better cuts of meat, richer dishes, desserts that don't appear on ordinary days. Extended family might gather, making Sunday dinner a small celebration repeated weekly. The meal acknowledges both the significance of the Sabbath and the need for pleasure in lives often short on it. Rest is technically the order of the day, though complete rest is impossible when animals still need feeding and children still need minding. But the work is lighter, the pace slower, the expectation different. You might spend the afternoon visiting neighbours, taking walks, reading, or simply sitting. The prohibition against Sunday labour varies by community and denomination. Some are strict, others more relaxed. But even in lenient places, Sunday has a different character than other days. Blue laws restrict commercial activity in many places, closing shops and prohibiting various activities deemed inappropriate for the Sabbath. The specific restrictions vary widely. Some communities ban essentially everything except church. Others merely limit saloon hours or prohibit particularly objectionable activities. These laws reflect the assumption that government has a role in enforcing religious observance, an assumption that will gradually erode but remains powerful in 1880. For those outside mainstream Christianity, Sunday presents particular challenges. Jewish Americans observe their Sabbath on Saturday, which often conflicts with work schedules that assume Sunday rest. Catholic immigrants face Protestant suspicion in many communities. Freethinkers and non-believers exist but often keep their skepticism quiet, aware that open irreligion can have social and economic consequences. The day winds down, the sun sets, and Monday's labour approaches. Sunday has provided rest for the body, instruction for the soul, and connection with community. Whether you approached it with genuine devotion or mere conformity, it structured your week, anchored your calendar, and reminded you that you're part of something larger than yourself. But speaking of larger, there's the question of actually getting anywhere beyond your immediate community. And in 1880 America, travelling any significant distance is its own adventure. The road stretches ahead, and stretches is the operative word. Whatever journey you're contemplating, visiting relatives, conducting business, seeking opportunity elsewhere, will take longer, cost more, and demand more physical endurance than modern travel has conditioned you to expect. Distance in 1880, America is measured not just in miles but in days, in discomfort, in genuine uncertainty about whether you'll arrive safely. Local travel means walking, riding, or driving a wagon. If you're fortunate, you own a horse, which extends your range significantly, but comes with its own costs in feeding, stabling, and maintenance. More likely, you walk to nearby destinations and arrange transportation for longer trips. The quality of roads varies from barely adequate to genuinely dangerous, depending on where you are and what season you're travelling. The roads themselves are mostly unpaved, dirt tracks that turn to mud in wet weather and dust in dry, that freeze into ruts in winter and soften into bogs in spring. Road maintenance is a local responsibility that varies enormously in how seriously it's taken. Some communities maintain roads in decent condition, others let them deteriorate until travel becomes nearly impossible. Impassable is a description that applies to many roads for significant portions of the year. Your wagon, if you're travelling by wagon, provides almost no suspension to speak of. Every bump, every rut, every stone in the road transmits directly to your body through a wooden seat that offers no padding worth mentioning. A day of wagon travel leaves you sore in ways that modern people rarely experience. Back aching, rear end bruised, general bodily complaint that makes the eventual arrival feel like genuine deliverance. Breakdowns happen, wheels crack, axles break, horses throw shoes or go lame. When something goes wrong on a lonely stretch of road, you fix it yourself if you can, seek help from the nearest farm if you can't, and wait if neither option is available. Carrying basic repair materials and knowing how to use them is simply part of travel preparation. Nobody assumes journeys will proceed without incident. The stagecoach offers more organised travel for those who can afford it, and who need to reach destinations along established routes. Stagecoach travel is faster than private wagon. The horses are changed at regular intervals, maintaining speed, but not more comfortable. You're packed into a coach with other travellers, bouncing over those same terrible roads, breathing the same dust and making conversation with strangers whether you want to or not. Long stagecoach journeys are endurance tests that leave passengers exhausted. Here's a detail that adds to the adventure. Highway robbery still exists. Bandits target stagecoaches carrying money or valuables, and isolated travellers are vulnerable to opportunistic criminals. The American West is particularly notorious for this, but eastern roads aren't entirely safe either. Travelling with valuables requires calculation about risk, and sometimes requires armed accompaniment. Historians still argue about how dangerous travel actually was in this era. Certainly violence occurred and people died on roads, but the majority of travellers completed their journeys without incident. The danger was real, but probably exaggerated in popular memory by the dramatic nature of the crimes that did occur. Still, the possibility shapes how you approach travel, encouraging caution and company. Rivers offer alternative transportation for those near them. Steamboats ply major waterways, the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Hudson, carrying passengers and cargo faster than land travel allows. River travel is more comfortable than roads, the boat's motion gentler than the constant jolting of wagons. But river travel has its own hazards. Boiler explosions, collisions, snags that can tear open hulls, and the general unpredictability of waterway navigation. The railroad, though, is changing everything. If you're near a rail line, and increasingly you probably are, the train represents travel transformed. Distances that took days by wagon take hours by rail. The discomfort is present but manageable. Passenger cars have seats, sometimes even upholstered ones, and the motion is smoother than any road vehicle. The railroad is knitting America together into something new, collapsing distances, creating national markets, enabling mobility that previous generations couldn't have imagined. Buying a train ticket is its own experience. You go to the depot, consult the schedule, schedules being a relatively new concept that railroads have introduced to American life, and purchase passage to your destination. The ticket might route you through multiple railroads with different gauges, requiring changes and sometimes delays. But the system works, more or less, connecting communities that had previously existed in relative isolation. The train station itself is a hub of activity in any town served by rail. People gather to see who's arriving, who's departing, what goods are coming in. The arrival of the train is an event, announced by whistle and bell, drawing attention from everyone within earshot. Young men dream of railroad jobs. Entrepreneurs see opportunities in railroad commerce. Communities fight to have rail lines extended to them, knowing that railroad access means economic vitality. Travelling any distance means planning for time away from work, from home, from responsibilities. Unlike modern travel, which can happen in a weekend, significant journeys in 1880 might require weeks. You arrange coverage for your duties, pack for extended absence, prepare for the unexpected. The effort required means travel is reserved for important purposes, not casual tourism, but business, family obligations, opportunity seeking. Lodging along the way presents its own challenges. Hotels exist in towns of any size, but quality varies dramatically. A respectable hotel offers private rooms, decent meals, reasonable cleanliness. A less reputable establishment might offer shared beds, questionable food, and bedmates of the insect variety. Travellers learn to evaluate lodgings quickly and to lower expectations when options are limited. The experience of arrival after a long journey is genuine relief. You step down from wagon, stage, or train into a new place, body weary but mobile, having crossed distances that your great-grandparents would have considered expeditions. The world is shrinking, becoming more connected, but it's still large enough that travel remains an achievement rather than a routine. And nowhere is this more true than along those iron rails that are reshaping the American landscape, the railroad that's transforming not just travel, but everything about how the nation works. The railroad is the most transformative technology of your era, and you're living through its effects in real time. The iron lines stretching across the continent are changing where people live, what they eat, how they work, and what seems possible. If you want to understand 1880 America, you need to understand what the railroad is doing to it. 40 years ago, there were fewer than 3,000 miles of railroad track in the entire country. Now there are over 90,000 miles, with more being laid constantly. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed just 11 years ago at Promontory Summit in Utah, has linked the Atlantic to the Pacific by rail. You can theoretically board a train in New York and arrive in San Francisco in about a week, a journey that previously took months by wagon or ship around Cape Horn. The railroads have created time zones. Before the railroad, every community kept its own time based on the sun's position. Noon was when the sun was highest, which varied by location. This worked fine when travel between communities took days. It became chaos when trains needed schedules that covered multiple localities, each with its own idiosyncratic clock. The railroads imposed standard time zones in 1883, dividing the continent into 4 bands where every clock shows the same time. Some communities resisted. Who was the railroad to tell them when noon was? But standardized time won because it had to. The economic impacts ripple through every aspect of American life. Farmers can now ship their products to distant markets, accessing buyers they never could have reached before. This expands opportunities but also exposes farmers to national competition and price fluctuations beyond local control. The railroad creates winners, communities along the lines, entrepreneurs who time their investments right, and losers, communities bypassed, businesses made obsolete by distant competitors who can now reach local markets. Towns appear almost overnight along rail lines. The railroad company surveys a route, builds a station, and suddenly there's reason for a settlement to exist where only prairie stood before. These railroad towns follow predictable patterns. The depot at the centre, businesses clustering nearby, residential areas spreading outward. Some of these towns will thrive and grow into cities, others will fade when routes change or expectations prove unrealistic. Here's a quirky detail about railroad impact. The railroad standardised track gauge, the distance between rails, through what was partly negotiation and partly ruthless business pressure. In the early railroad era, different lines used different gauges, making it impossible to run trains across different systems. This obviously created problems, and gradually the standard gauge of 4 feet, 8.5 inches, won out. But getting there required enormous capital investment in rebuilding incompatible lines, and the process created business opportunities for those who saw it coming. The railroad also shapes what you eat and wear, though you might not notice directly. Beef from Texas ranches reaches your table because of trains that carry cattle to slaughterhouses in Chicago and then distribute the meat nationwide. Wheat from Kansas mills into flour that stocks stores in New York. Oranges from California, cotton from the South, manufactured goods from eastern factories. All of it moves by rail, creating a national economy where previously there were mostly regional ones. Working for the railroad is dangerous and demanding, but pays relatively well. Railroad workers include the men who actually operate trains, engineers, firemen, conductors, and the vast armies who build and maintain the lines, section hands, bridge builders, tunnellers. The work is physically demanding and accident rates are high, but railroad jobs offer steady wages, geographic mobility, and a sense of participating in something modern and important. Historians still argue about whether the railroad's overall impact was positive or negative for American society. The railroad certainly accelerated economic growth, enabled westward expansion, and connected the nation in unprecedented ways. But they also concentrated wealth in the hands of railroad barons, enabled environmental destruction, displaced native peoples from their lands, and created boom and bust cycles that harmed the communities dependent on them. The moral accounting is complicated. The railroad touches politics directly. Railroad companies are among the most powerful economic entities in the country, and they wield that power politically. They lobby for favourable legislation, influence elections, and sometimes engage in outright corruption to protect their interests. The debates over railroad regulation, whether government should constrain railroad monopolies, regulate rates, prevent discriminatory pricing, are among the most contentious political fights of the era. Travelling by train is its own experience, one that's distinctly modern compared to everything else about 1880 life. You buy your ticket, find your car, first class if you can afford it, second class or emigrant class if you can't, and settle in for the journey. The scenery slides past the windows at speeds that still feel remarkable to people who remember when 30 miles per hour was unimaginably fast. Time passes in this suspended state, neither home nor destination, moving through landscape that becomes background rather than obstacle. The stations themselves are becoming architectural statements. Grand terminals in major cities feature soaring ceilings, elaborate decoration, and spaces designed to inspire awe. These buildings announce that the railroad is not merely functional but cultural, that arriving by train should feel significant. Even smaller stations often feature distinctive architecture that marks them as important civic spaces. The railroad makes certain things possible that wouldn't be otherwise. The rapid communication of news via reporters who ride trains to reach telegraph offices, the movement of the mail, which now crosses the country in days rather than weeks. The coordination of military forces demonstrated devastatingly in the Civil War and shaping defence planning ever since. The railroad is infrastructure in the deepest sense, the foundation on which other activities build. You feel the presence of the railroad even if you're not riding one. You hear the whistles, you see the tracks, you notice the rhythms of community life organised around arrival and departure times. The railroad has reshaped not just transportation but the entire experience of American life, and you're living in the middle of that transformation. But for all its modern marvels, the railroad can't change the fundamental reality of what awaits you most days. Work. Endless, exhausting, unavoidable work that fills hours and years and entire lives. Work is the organizing principle of your existence, and organizing might be too gentle a word. Work consumes. Work devours. Work claims the hours between waking and sleeping with a thoroughness that modern labour laws have worked hard to prevent and modern workers have largely forgotten. In 1880 America, you work because the alternative is not working, which means not eating, not having shelter, not surviving. The workday stretches to lengths that would be illegal in most developed nations a century later. 12 hours is common, 14 hours is not unusual. 16-hour days during busy seasons are simply what's required. The concept of the 8-hour workday exists. Labour activists are fighting for it. But for most workers it remains a dream rather than a reality. You work until the work is done, or until you physically cannot continue, and then you sleep briefly before beginning again. What you do during those hours depends on where and who you are. Agricultural labour still employs the plurality of American workers, and farming is relentless in ways that other occupations are not. Crops don't wait for convenient schedules. Animals need attention every day, regardless of weather, health, or personal circumstances. The rhythm of farm life is dictated by seasons, sunlight, and the non-negotiable demands of growing things. Farm work is physically demanding in ways that most modern people have never experienced. Ploughing behind horses or mules tests endurance and strength. Planting requires bending, stooping, kneeling for hours. Harvesting is brutal, repetitive motion. Swinging scythes, gathering sheaves, lifting and carrying and loading, until your body screams for rest that isn't coming. And then there's the livestock to tend, the fences to maintain, the equipment to repair, the 1,000 tasks that comprise running a working farm. Factory work offers different challenges. The mills and plants that have spread across industrial America operate on schedules determined by machines rather than seasons. But the work is no less demanding. You stand at your station, operating a loom, tending a machine, performing repetitive tasks, for hour after hour, maintaining pace with the mechanical rhythm that cares nothing for your fatigue. The air might be thick with dust or fumes, the noise might damage your hearing, the danger of moving machinery is constant. Industrial accidents are common enough to be almost expected. A moment's inattention, and you've lost a finger, a hand, sometimes more. Safety regulations barely exist. Equipment that should have guards doesn't have them. Workers who are exhausted make mistakes, and the machines don't forgive mistakes. The injured worker typically loses their job along with their limb. No workers' compensation systems yet exist to protect them. Here's a detail that illustrates the era's attitude toward industrial labour. There's virtually no distinction between work time and personal time for many workers. Factory workers might eat their meals at their stations. Domestic servants are essentially always on duty. Even workers with nominally set hours often find themselves called upon for extra work without additional compensation. The boundary between labour and life that later generations will fight to establish doesn't exist yet. Women work, though their work is often invisible in official statistics. Domestic labour, the endless cooking, cleaning, washing, mending, childcare, is work in every meaningful sense. But it's not counted as employment because it doesn't generate cash wages. Women who do work for wages often do so in domestic service for other families, or in textile mills, or in various forms of piecework done at home. Their wages are lower than men's for comparable work, a disparity that's not questioned because it reflects assumptions about women's proper role. Children work, as we've discussed, filling roles in factories, farms and homes that would be considered child abuse by later standards. The labour of children is simply part of the economic equation, and families who kept their children home from work might not be able to survive. Reform movements are beginning to argue against child labour, but real change is decades away. Historians still argue about whether workers in this era were exploited or merely living in a world where hard labour was universally necessary. Exploitation certainly occurred. Employers who cheated workers, conditions that were unnecessarily dangerous, pay that barely sustained life. But it's also true that productivity and living standards were simply lower, that the machinery and systems that would eventually make prosperity possible didn't yet exist. The moral evaluation is complicated by recognizing both real injustice and genuine constraints. Sundays offer nominal rest. But even Sundays aren't completely free from work. Essential tasks continue: feeding livestock, preparing food, maintaining the irreducible minimum of household function. The prohibition against Sunday labour varies by community and occupation. Some employers ignore it entirely, especially in industries where continuous operation is economically necessary. Holidays provide occasional breaks, but fewer than you might expect. Christmas is celebrated but might be a single day off rather than an extended season. Independence Day, Thanksgiving. These punctuate the calendar but don't fundamentally alter the rhythm of continuous labour. The concept of vacation as we know it, extended time away from work for rest and recreation, is available only to the wealthy. The physical toll accumulates over years, bodies wear out, joints fail, backs give out. Workers who began at 12 or 14 find themselves worn down by 30 or 40. Their productive years diminishing just as their obligations, families, debts, aging parents, increase. There's no social security, no pension system for most workers, no safety net except what family and community can provide. Working yourself out, then depending on the next generation to support you, is simply how life proceeds. And yet, in the midst of this labour, people find meaning, dignity, and even satisfaction. Work well done has value. Skills mastered provide identity. The knowledge that your efforts sustain your family carries weight that matters. The relationship between labour and humanity is complex. Work can destroy, but it can also define and ennoble. Which it does depends on circumstances that vary person to person, job to job, day to day. But perhaps nowhere is the weight of expected labour heavier than on the women who carry not just their own work, but the work of maintaining everyone else's ability to work. The woman in 1880 America occupies a position that's simultaneously central and subordinate, essential and constrained. She's expected to be the heart of the home, the moral compass of the family, the tireless worker who makes everyone else's work possible. She's not expected to vote, own property in her own name in many places, pursue education beyond certain limits, or exercise authority in the public sphere. Her world is bounded by expectations that later generations will fight to demolish. Your day begins before anyone else's. If you're the woman of the household, mother, wife, eldest daughter, you're likely the first up, starting the fire, beginning breakfast preparations, ensuring that others can begin their days properly. You might have been the last to bed as well, finishing tasks that couldn't be completed during daylight, sitting up with sick children, waiting for a husband who came home late. The hours allocated to women's rest are whatever hours remain after everyone else's needs are met. The domestic labour that fills your day is invisible precisely because it's constant. Cooking, cleaning, washing, mending, childcare, nursing the sick, managing supplies, maintaining the household in its 1,000 daily requirements. This work doesn't produce dramatic results or countable products. It simply prevents decay, disorder, and discomfort. A woman's work is never done because the moment she stops doing it, the need begins accumulating again. Childbearing is expected, frequent, and dangerous. The average woman in 1880 America gives birth to multiple children, 5, 6, 7 or more in many families. Each pregnancy brings risk, complications during delivery, infections afterward, the general toll on a body that's perpetually either pregnant, nursing, or recovering from both. Maternal mortality is high enough that every woman who's given birth knows someone who didn't survive the experience. You love your children, want your children, and also understand that having them might kill you. Contraception is limited, unreliable, and in some places illegal. The Comstock laws, passed in 1873, prohibit sending obscene materials through the mail, and this definition has been interpreted to include contraceptive information and devices. Women who want to limit their pregnancies rely on methods ranging from abstinence to various folk remedies of varying effectiveness. The Malthusian approach, withdrawal, is probably the most common method, though its reliability leaves much to be desired. Here's a detail about women's lives that might surprise modern readers. Married women in many states have limited legal existence separate from their husbands. Under the legal doctrine of coverture, a married woman's legal identity is absorbed into her husband's. She cannot sign contracts, own property, sue or be sued in her own name. Reform of these laws is underway. The Married Women's Property Acts have been passed in many states, but the progress is uneven and the fundamental assumption that wives are dependents persists. Education for girls is available but often truncated. Girls attend common schools alongside boys, learning basic literacy and arithmetic. But advanced education, college, professional training, is much rarer for women. A handful of women's colleges exist, and co-educational institutions are slowly increasing. But the assumption that women don't need extensive education because their sphere is domestic remains powerful. Women who pursue education and careers face social judgment that men in similar positions don't experience. Working women face particular challenges. Those who work for wages, domestic servants, factory workers, teachers, nurses, earn less than men for comparable labour. Occupational segregation channels women into certain fields and excludes them from others. The assumption that women work temporarily, until marriage, justifies lower wages even for women who will work their entire lives, and the double burden of paid work plus domestic responsibility at home means that working women never really stop working. Historians still argue about how oppressive women's circumstances actually were in this era, versus how much women found meaning, power and satisfaction within the constraints they faced. The answer is probably both, and it depends. Some women experienced their lives as prisons of endless labour and limited opportunity. Others found genuine fulfilment in domestic life, in the raising of children, in the religious and social roles available to them. Individual experience varied enormously based on class, region, personality and circumstance. The women's rights movement exists and is fighting for change. The Seneca Falls Convention launched the movement for women's suffrage 32 years ago, and activists continue pressing for the vote, for property rights, for access to education and professions. But progress is slow, resistance is strong, and the full achievement of women's political equality is still 40 years in the future. For now, women work within the constraints that exist, pushing against them where possible. Unmarried women face their own particular challenges. Spinsters, the very word carries judgment, have limited respectable options. They might remain in their parents' homes, caring for aging relatives. They might work in the few occupations open to respectable single women, teaching, nursing, domestic service. They might achieve genuine independence if they have resources or unusual circumstances. But the cultural assumption is that a woman's proper destiny is marriage and motherhood, and those who don't achieve it are pitied or suspected. Widows occupy an ambivalent position, no longer under a husband's authority but often without resources. A widow might inherit property if the law allows it, and if there's property to inherit. She might remarry if she's young enough and has opportunity. She might struggle through on whatever combination of work, charity and family support she can arrange. The death of a husband often means economic as well as emotional devastation. Your day continues. Tasks don't wait while you contemplate your circumstances. The children need attention. The house needs maintenance. The meals need preparation. Whatever philosophical questions might arise about your position in society, the immediate demands of living leave little time to dwell on them. You do what must be done because the alternative is everything falling apart. And yet, within these constraints, women build lives, find joy, exercise influence, and persist. They raise children who will eventually reshape the world. They maintain communities through their social labour. They work toward changes that will benefit future generations of women. The story isn't only constraint and suffering, it's also agency, resilience, and the slow bending of the arc toward justice. But there's another story unfolding in 1880 America, one that's bringing millions of new faces, new languages, and new hopes to American shores. The ship disgorges its human cargo onto a dock that seems impossibly solid after weeks at sea, and you step into America, if you're one of the millions arriving in these years, stepping into a country you might know only from letters, rumours and dreams. Immigration is reshaping the nation, filling cities with new faces, new languages, new customs that both enrich and disturb the existing order. You might be one of these newcomers, or you might be watching them arrive, uncertain whether to welcome or fear what they represent. The numbers are staggering. In 1880 alone, nearly 500,000 immigrants arrive in the United States. Over the decade, the total will exceed 5 million. They come from Ireland and Germany, as earlier waves did, but increasingly from new sources: Italy, Poland, Russia, the lands of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Scandinavia, China, until exclusion laws cut off that flow. Each group brings its own language, its own traditions, its own reasons for leaving home and seeking opportunity elsewhere. The journey itself is an ordeal that tests endurance and hope alike. Steerage class on a transatlantic steamer means weeks in crowded holds, with minimal ventilation, inadequate sanitation, and food that barely sustains life. Disease spreads easily in these conditions. Some passengers don't survive the crossing. Those who do arrive weakened, disoriented, possessing little more than the clothes they wear and whatever they manage to carry aboard. This is not travel, this is survival in transit. Castle Garden at the southern tip of Manhattan serves as the primary immigrant processing centre in these years. Ellis Island won't open until 1892. Here, the arriving masses face inspection, questioning and bureaucratic procedures that will determine whether they can enter or must return to wherever they fled. Most pass through successfully, but the experience leaves its mark. The first taste of American officialdom, the first demonstration that you must prove your worthiness to be here. What awaits beyond the processing centre depends enormously on your resources and connections. Those with family already established in America have somewhere to go, someone to guide them through the initial confusion. Those without connections face the challenge of finding shelter, work, and community in a city that can seem both overwhelming and indifferent. Ethnic enclaves form partly as defence mechanisms. Clustering with people who share your language and customs makes the transition more manageable. Here's a detail that illustrates the immigrant experience. Many arrivals never intended to stay permanently. The concept of birds of passage, workers who came to earn money and return home, was common, especially among certain nationalities. Young men would work for years, sending wages back to families in Europe, eventually returning themselves. Some found reasons to stay, others fulfilled their original plans. The idea of immigration as permanent one-way journey doesn't capture the reality of movement back and forth across the Atlantic. The work available to immigrants is typically the work that native-born Americans prefer not to do. Construction labour, especially the dangerous work of building railroads and digging tunnels. Factory work in the most unpleasant industries. Domestic service for those with cleaning and cooking skills. The jobs are hard, the pay is low, and the conditions are often dangerous. But they're jobs, which is more than many immigrants could find at home. Urban neighbourhoods transform under the weight of immigrant concentration. Little Italy, Chinatown, the Lower East Side's Jewish Quarter. These ethnic neighbourhoods develop their own characters, their own economies, their own social structures. They're criticised by native-born observers as foreign implants, failures of assimilation, threats to American identity. They're defended by their inhabitants as necessary adaptations, communities of mutual support in a hostile environment. Both perspectives contain truth. Historians still argue about how welcoming or hostile America was to its immigrants in this era. The official rhetoric celebrates the nation as a refuge for the oppressed, a land of opportunity for all. The lived reality includes persistent discrimination, violence against immigrant groups, and legislative efforts to restrict immigration from unwanted sources. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 will explicitly bar Chinese immigration, the first significant restriction based on nationality. Anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, and generalized nativist sentiment runs high in many communities. The immigrants themselves are not passive recipients of whatever America offers. They organize, forming mutual aid societies, ethnic associations, labor unions, political clubs. They establish newspapers in their own languages, churches and synagogues that maintain old country traditions, schools that teach children to navigate between cultures. They advocate for their interests, fight discrimination, and gradually carve out space for themselves in a society that often resists their presence. The children of immigrants face particular pressures. Born in America or brought young, they straddle worlds, the old country culture of their parents and the American culture of their peers and institutions. Some embrace assimilation eagerly, abandoning languages and customs to become as American as possible. Others resist, maintaining traditions as a matter of identity and loyalty. Most navigate somewhere between these poles, creating hybrid identities that are neither purely old world nor purely new. The economic impact of immigration is subject to intense debate in 1880, just as it will be in every subsequent era. Advocates argue that immigrants provide necessary labour, create businesses, and invigorate the economy. Critics argue that immigrants depress wages, take jobs from native workers, and become burdens on public resources. The arguments are familiar because they've never really stopped. What's undeniable is that immigration is changing what America is. The nation that exists in 1880 is different from the nation that existed in 1850, or will exist in 1910. More diverse, more urban, more complicated. The ideal of the homogeneous American, white, Protestant, English-speaking, has never been entirely accurate, but immigration makes its inadequacy increasingly obvious. America is becoming something new, forged from many sources, and the process is neither smooth nor complete. You might be part of this process, newly arrived or descended from recent arrivals, navigating between the world you left and the world you're trying to enter. Or you might be watching it happen, wondering what it means for the country you thought you knew. Either way, immigration is shaping the 1880s in ways that will resonate for generations, but there's another shaping force at work, another movement of people across the landscape. Out west, the frontier still beckons with promises that are partly true and partly fantasy. The frontier calls with a voice that's part promise, part propaganda, and part genuine opportunity. Out where the land stretches empty, or at least seems to, where the railroad ends or hasn't yet reached, where the government is giving away homesteads to anyone willing to claim them. Out there, you might make something of yourself, or you might fail, suffer, and die far from anyone who remembers your name. The frontier offers both possibilities in roughly equal measure. The Homestead Act of 1862 remains the legal framework for Western settlement. File a claim, improve the land, live on it for 5 years, and 160 acres becomes yours, free or nearly so. The promise is extraordinary. Land, the fundamental basis of wealth and independence, available to anyone with the courage to claim it. The reality is more complicated, but the promise draws hundreds of thousands westward. What you find on the frontier depends on where you settle and when you arrive. The Great Plains present vast grasslands that seem ideal for farming until you understand what the climate actually does. Rainfall is unpredictable and often insufficient. The soil, while fertile, is bound by root systems that break ordinary ploughs. Summer brings scorching heat. Winter brings killing cold. Grasshoppers arrive in plagues that can strip a farm bare in hours. This is not the pastoral landscape of eastern farming, but something harsher and more demanding. Building a home on the plains often means building it from what's available, which on treeless prairie means sod. You cut rectangles of grass and earth, stack them like bricks, and create walls that are sturdy enough but perpetually dirty, occasionally inhabited by insects and rodents, and prone to leaking when it rains. The soddy is frontier housing stripped to its most basic. Shelter from the elements, nothing more. Settlers who've known frame houses in the east find sod houses demoralising in their primitive functionality. Water is precious, always the limiting factor. You dig wells to uncertain depths, hoping to strike water, sometimes finding it, sometimes not. You collect rainwater, ration carefully, and learn to live with less than you'd like. The myth of the frontier as abundant is precisely wrong in many locations. Scarcity defines daily life, and survival depends on managing it successfully. Here's a detail that captures frontier isolation. The nearest neighbour might be miles away, the nearest town a day's journey. The social connections that structure eastern life, churches, markets, community gatherings, exist only thinly on the frontier. Women especially report crushing loneliness, the absence of the female networks that provide support, companionship and shared labour. Mental health suffers in isolation, and frontier communities will eventually develop informal systems for managing those who crack under the pressure. The Western expansion also means displacement of the native peoples who lived on this land first. The Indian Wars are winding down by 1880, but they're not over, and the wounds are fresh. Native tribes have been pushed onto reservations through a combination of military force, broken treaties, and policies explicitly designed to destroy their way of life. The buffalo herds that sustained plains cultures have been hunted nearly to extinction. What settlers experience as empty land awaiting improvement, native peoples experience as homeland stolen and desecrated. Historians still argue about how to characterize Western expansion, as the bold pioneering spirit that built a nation, or as conquest and genocide that destroyed existing civilizations, or as some complicated mixture of both. The truth includes genuine courage and genuine crime, opportunity for some and catastrophe for others. The story you tell depends on whose perspective you centre, and 1880, America is mostly telling the story from the settlers' point of view. Cowboys become iconic figures during this era, driving cattle from Texas to railroad towns in Kansas, where the animals can be shipped east. The cattle drive is genuinely dramatic. Weeks on the trail, managing herds that can number in the thousands, facing weather, stampedes, and the general unpredictability of moving animals across hundreds of miles. But the cowboy's life is also lonely, low-paid, and dangerous. The romantic image will outlast the actual cattle driving era, which is already declining as railroads extend and make the long drives unnecessary. Mining booms create instant towns that can disappear almost as quickly. Gold, silver, copper, wherever valuable minerals are discovered, fortune seekers flood in, and communities spring up to service them. These mining towns are rough, violent, mostly male, governed by improvised law or no law at all. Some will become permanent settlements. Many will become ghost towns when the minerals play out, or prove less abundant than hoped. The frontier is also a safety valve for national tensions, or at least that's one theory. In a crowded East with limited opportunities, frustration might build towards social explosion. The open West provides an outlet. Anyone dissatisfied with their circumstances can start over on new land. Whether this actually prevents revolution is debatable, but the idea shapes policy and public understanding of what the frontier means. Women on the frontier often find themselves doing work that would be considered men's work elsewhere. When survival depends on all available labour, gender roles bend to accommodate necessity. Women plough fields, tend livestock, defend homesteads, whatever needs doing. Some find this liberating, an escape from the constraining expectations of Eastern gentility. Others find it simply exhausting, additional labour piled onto the endless domestic work that follows them wherever they go. The frontier is closing, though this isn't widely recognised yet. The superintendent of the census will officially declare the frontier closed in 1890, but already the best lands are claimed, the easiest opportunities taken. Future generations will inherit a West that's been divided, developed and incorporated into the national economy, still less densely settled than the East, still marked by its distinctive landscape and history, but no longer the open territory where anyone can start fresh. You might be there now on the frontier, building something from nothing and hoping it will endure. Or you might be contemplating the journey, weighing opportunity against risk, dreaming of land while knowing the dreams might not survive contact with reality. Either way, the West shapes American consciousness, American possibility, and American mythology in ways that will persist long after the physical frontier is gone. But while the frontier represents openness and possibility, the cities growing in the East represent something different: concentration, intensity, and the birth of modern urban life. The city pulses with an energy that nothing else in 1880 America can match. It's loud, crowded, filthy, dangerous, innovative, and alive in ways that rural and small-town existence simply isn't. You come to the city, or you're already here, because this is where things happen, where opportunity concentrates, where the future is being built. The city is also where you might be crushed, lost, corrupted, or killed. The risks are as concentrated as the opportunities. The American city of 1880 is growing at rates that strain every system designed to manage human habitation. New York has over 1 million residents, making it one of the largest cities on Earth. Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, St. Louis, and others are expanding rapidly, their populations swelling with immigrants from abroad and migrants from American farms and small towns. The infrastructure meant to serve thousands must somehow accommodate hundreds of thousands, and it's not keeping up. Housing is the most visible crisis. Tenement buildings, multi-story structures designed to pack the maximum number of families into minimum space, fill immigrant neighborhoods. A single tenement might house dozens of families in conditions that defy description. Tiny rooms, shared toilets, minimal ventilation, no natural light in interior spaces, fire traps where a single spark could kill hundreds. These buildings are profitable for their owners precisely because they house so many people so cheaply, and market incentives don't favour safety or comfort. The streets themselves are battlegrounds of competing uses. Horses, wagons, streetcars and pedestrians compete for space on thoroughfares that weren't designed for current traffic levels. The horse manure we discussed earlier accumulates faster than it can be removed. Vendors set up wherever they can. Children play in streets because there's nowhere else to play. The noise is constant. Hooves on cobblestones, wheels on iron rails, the clatter and clamour of commercial activity, and the shouts of humans trying to be heard over everything else. Here's a quirky detail about urban life. Elevated railways are transforming city transportation in the 1880s. New York's elevated lines, running above street level on iron frameworks, represent cutting-edge transit technology. They're noisy, they're ugly, they drip oil and debris on pedestrians below, but they move people efficiently through crowded streets where surface transportation bogs down. The elevated railway changes urban geography, making distant neighbourhoods accessible and sparking development along its routes. Disease thrives in urban conditions: cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis. These are city diseases, flourishing where water supplies are contaminated, where crowding facilitates transmission, where poverty prevents adequate nutrition and medical care. Public health is becoming a discipline specifically because cities force recognition that individual health depends on collective conditions. Clean water systems, proper sewage disposal, food safety regulations. These are urban projects driven by urban necessity. Crime flourishes alongside disease. The urban underworld of 1880 includes organised gangs, petty thieves, confidence men, prostitutes, and a general criminal class that preys on the vulnerable and careless. Police forces exist but are often corrupt, more interested in collecting bribes than preventing crime. Areas like New York's Five Points become notorious for danger, places where respectable citizens don't venture after dark and where the lives of the poor are shaped by violence and exploitation. Historians still argue about whether cities were net positive or negative for those who lived in them during this era. On one hand, cities offered economic opportunities unavailable elsewhere. Factory jobs, commercial positions, the chance to make something of yourself in ways that rural life didn't allow. On the other hand, cities concentrated poverty, disease, and exploitation in ways that could make life genuinely worse than the rural poverty people fled. The answer depended on individual circumstances. Some found opportunity, others found only new forms of suffering. The wealthy occupy a different city entirely. They live in townhouses on fashionable streets or in emerging suburbs connected to the city by rail. They shop at department stores, a new innovation that offer vast selections of goods in luxurious settings. They attend theatres, concerts, and social events that take place in buildings designed to exclude the masses. The gap between rich and poor is visible, dramatic, and growing, a central concern that will shape politics and reform movements for generations. The city is also where innovation concentrates. Edison's electric light illuminates parts of Manhattan by 1882. The telephone spreads through business districts, enabling communication that seems almost magical. Department stores pioneer new retail techniques. Newspapers achieve mass circulation, shaping public opinion on an unprecedented scale. The city is where the future arrives first, where technologies and ideas are tested, where the modern world is being invented. Public spaces provide respite from urban intensity. Central Park in New York, conceived specifically as a retreat from city pressures, offers designed landscapes where urbanites can experience something like nature without leaving the city. Other cities follow suit, creating parks that serve democratic purposes, spaces where all classes can mingle, where children can play, where the relentless density of urban life offers brief relief. Immigration has made American cities extraordinarily diverse. You hear a dozen languages on city streets. You smell foods from countries most native-born Americans couldn't locate on a map. You encounter customs, religions, and appearances that challenge any notion of homogeneous American identity. The city is a mixing zone where cultures collide, compete, and gradually blend into something new, or maintain their distinctiveness in ethnic enclaves that persist for generations. The experience of urban life is sensory overload for those not accustomed to it. After rural quiet, the noise is overwhelming. After small-town familiarity, the anonymity is disorienting. After spaces where you know everyone, the crowds of strangers can feel threatening or liberating depending on your temperament. The city demands adjustment, adaptation, and often fundamentally changes people who spend significant time within its boundaries. You navigate the city by developing mental maps of safe routes, useful services, and places to avoid. You learn which neighbourhoods are yours and which are not, where to shop for specific goods, how to move through crowds without drawing unwanted attention. Urban competence is a skill set that takes time to acquire, and the city can be hostile to those who haven't learned its ways. The city is the present, but it's also the future, a preview of what America is becoming as industrialization and urbanization transform the nation. But as the city represents change, other changes are creeping forward more slowly, technologies that will eventually transform everything. The future is arriving in pieces, scattered innovations that haven't yet assembled into the transformation they'll eventually produce. Technology in 1880 is advancing on multiple fronts, and if you're paying attention, you can see hints of what's coming, or at least hints that something is coming, even if the specific shape remains unclear. The telephone is the wonder of the moment for those who've encountered it. Alexander Graham Bell patented his device just 4 years ago, and already telephone lines connect businesses and wealthy homes in major cities. The experience of speaking to someone who isn't present, hearing their voice carried over wires, seems almost miraculous. Most people have never made a telephone call. The technology is expensive and limited. But awareness of its existence spreads through newspapers and word of mouth. Something fundamental about communication is changing. The infrastructure required for telephone service limits its spread. Wires must be strung between every telephone, creating networks that become tangled messes of cables in urban areas. Exchanges handle connections, with operators manually plugging calls into the appropriate circuits. The system is expensive to build and maintain, restricting service to those who can afford monthly rates beyond most family budgets. But the direction of travel is clear. The telephone will spread, prices will fall, and eventually instantaneous voice communication will become routine. Electric light is moving from demonstration to practical application. Edison's Pearl Street station in New York will begin providing electrical service in 1882, supplying power to lights in nearby buildings. The incandescent bulb offers illumination cleaner, safer, and more convenient than gas or kerosene. No flames, no fumes, just a glowing filament that transforms the night. For now, electricity is another rich man's luxury, available only where generating stations exist, and only to those who can pay premium rates. But like the telephone, the trajectory points toward universal adoption. Here's a detail that captures the pace of change. Many technological marvels of the era are demonstrated but not yet practical. Phonographs exist but are scientific curiosities rather than consumer products. Typewriters are beginning to appear in offices, gradually transforming clerical work. Sewing machines have already transformed textile production, and home sewing alike. Each innovation builds on others, creating compound effects that accelerate the overall pace of change. Photography has become accessible to ordinary people, though it's not yet the instant, ubiquitous image capture of later eras. Photographic studios offer portraits that families treasure as records of faces that might otherwise exist only in memory. The camera is still complicated and expensive. Amateur photography is possible, but requires dedication and resources. But the idea that images can be fixed permanently, that a moment can be captured and preserved, has become part of common understanding. Historians still argue about how Americans in this era understood the pace of change they were experiencing. Some clearly recognized that their world was transforming with unprecedented speed. Others probably experienced each innovation as simply a new thing, without necessarily perceiving a pattern. The vocabulary for discussing technological progress, innovation, disruption, belongs to later generations. But the experience of living through change was real, even if the language to describe it was still developing. Transportation continues evolving beyond the railroad. The safety bicycle is transforming personal mobility. 2 wheels of equal size, pneumatic tyres, a chain-driven rear wheel, creating a practical human-powered vehicle that will spark cycling crazes and eventually inspire the automobile engineers of the next generation. Horse-drawn streetcars are becoming electric streetcars in some cities. The idea of the automobile exists in experiments and prototypes, though practical horseless carriages are still years away. Medicine is advancing despite the limitations we discussed earlier. Germ theory is gaining acceptance, and its implications for sanitation and surgical practice are beginning to register. Anesthesia makes surgery survivable in ways it simply wasn't before. Vaccines for smallpox have been available for decades. Vaccines for other diseases are under development. The trajectory, however slow, points toward medicine that actually helps more often than it harms. Printing technology has made mass communication possible in ways that shape public consciousness. Newspapers circulate in the hundreds of thousands daily. Magazines reach national audiences with content that ranges from serious journalism to frivolous entertainment. The ability to produce and distribute printed material cheaply creates industries, publishing, advertising, journalism, that employ thousands and shape public opinion on everything from politics to fashion. Education is spreading, with public schools reaching more children for longer periods than ever before. Literacy rates are climbing. The expectation that ordinary children should learn to read, write, and calculate is becoming universal even as the quality and duration of education vary enormously. The educational system that will eventually become truly universal is taking shape in the 1880s, though it's far from complete. The idea of progress, the belief that things are getting better and will continue to get better through human effort and invention, is powerful in 1880 America. This faith in progress shapes politics, justifies expansion, and provides ideological framework for accepting the disruptions of industrialization. Not everyone shares this optimism. Workers displaced by machines, farmers pressed by railroads, traditional communities disrupted by change. But the dominant narrative celebrates advancement. You live in this moment of transition, able to see both what exists and hints of what's coming. The telephone will connect you to distant voices. Electric light will banish darkness at the flip of a switch. Machines will do work that currently requires human muscle. The world your grandchildren inhabit will be unrecognizably different from the world you know. Whether this prospect excites or frightens depends on your temperament and circumstances. The changes aren't evenly distributed, of course. Rural areas lag behind cities. The poor experience innovations later than the rich. And some groups are excluded from the benefits of progress by deliberate policies designed to maintain existing hierarchies. The promise of technology is real, but so are the structures that determine who benefits and who suffers. Speaking of those structures, there's one aspect of 1880 American life we haven't fully addressed: the racial divisions that shape daily experience for millions of Americans. The promise of freedom made 15 years ago is being broken in real time. The Civil War ended slavery. The constitutional amendments that followed extended citizenship and voting rights to formerly enslaved people. Reconstruction attempted to rebuild the South on new foundations. Now, in 1880, that attempt is failing. The federal government has largely withdrawn from enforcing civil rights in the former Confederacy, and the systems that will become Jim Crow are taking shape. If you're black in the American South, and more than 90% of black Americans still live in the South in 1880, your daily life is increasingly circumscribed by laws, customs, and violence designed to maintain white supremacy despite the formal abolition of slavery. The progress of Reconstruction is being reversed, the promises of citizenship are being broken, and the patterns that will define American race relations for nearly another century are being established. Voting rights illustrate the pattern. The 15th Amendment prohibits denying the vote based on race. Southern states respond with poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and other mechanisms that technically don't mention race but effectively exclude black voters. When legal mechanisms aren't sufficient, violence supplements them. Black men who attempt to vote face threats, beatings, even murder. The political power that black communities briefly exercised during Reconstruction evaporates. Economic conditions keep most black Americans in positions not far removed from slavery. Sharecropping and tenant farming have replaced slavery's formal bonds with economic bonds nearly as restrictive. You work the land owned by someone else, borrowing against your future crop for supplies you need today, ending each year in debt that carries forward indefinitely. The system is designed to extract labour while maintaining the illusion of freedom. You're technically free to leave, but you can't leave while you owe debt, and you always owe debt. Here's a detail that captures the precariousness of black life in this era: the convict lease system. Southern states arrest black men on minor charges, vagrancy, loitering, charges that can be applied essentially at will, and lease their labour to private businesses. The prisoners work mines, farms and factories under conditions that are often worse than slavery, because the lessee has no investment in the prisoner's long-term health. Death rates are horrifying. The system provides cheap labour to businesses and revenue to states while maintaining white control over black bodies. Violence is constant and systematic. Lynching, extrajudicial murder, often public and theatrical, becomes a tool of racial terrorism that will peak in the coming decades. Accused of crimes real or imagined, black men, and sometimes women, are tortured and killed by white mobs, while authorities look away or actively participate. The message is explicit. Black Americans who don't accept their subordinate position risk death. The trauma extends beyond the immediate victims to entire communities living under this threat. Historians still argue about how to characterize this era. As a failure of reconstruction, a betrayal of promises, a retreat from justice, or simply a transition between different phases of white supremacy. The Civil War ended slavery but didn't end racism, or the structures that racism had created. What's emerging in the 1880s is a new racial order that maintains black subordination through methods that are technically legal or at least tolerated by a federal government unwilling to intervene. Black Americans resist, survive, and build despite these conditions. Black churches serve as community centers, sources of spiritual sustenance, and organizing spaces beyond white control. Black schools educate children even when resources are minimal and buildings are inadequate. Black businesses serve black customers when white businesses won't. The institutions that will sustain black communities through decades of oppression are taking shape, often invisible to white observers but essential to black survival. Migration offers one form of escape. Some black Americans move north, seeking economic opportunity and escape from the most intense racial terrorism. Northern cities aren't free from racism. Discrimination in housing, employment, and daily life is widespread. But the forms are different, sometimes less violent, sometimes more opportunity for economic advancement. This migration will accelerate dramatically in the 20th century, but it begins in these post-Reconstruction years. The West presents another option. Black settlers homestead on the Great Plains, establishing all-black towns in Kansas, Oklahoma, and elsewhere. Black soldiers, the Buffalo Soldiers, serve in the Army's Western campaigns. Black cowboys work cattle drives alongside white and Mexican counterparts. The West isn't free from racism either, but its social structures are sometimes more fluid, offering possibilities that the South forecloses. The response of white America to black aspirations is complex and varied. Some white Americans support civil rights, continuing the abolitionist tradition. Many more are indifferent, preferring to ignore questions that don't directly affect them, and a substantial portion actively works to maintain white supremacy, whether through violence, politics, or the simple daily maintenance of discriminatory customs. The failure to enforce Reconstruction reflects not just political calculation, but widespread white unwillingness to accept black equality. Black intellectual and political leadership is emerging, developing strategies for survival and advancement under conditions of extreme constraint. Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, and others debate the best paths forward. Accommodation versus agitation, economic development versus political struggle, staying south versus moving north. These debates will continue for generations because the problems they address will persist for generations. The racial order of 1880. America isn't a temporary aberration that will naturally correct itself. It's a system that requires active dismantling, and that dismantling will take decades of struggle, sacrifice, and resistance. The children born in 1880 will live their entire adult lives under Jim Crow. Their grandchildren will still be fighting for rights that were supposedly guaranteed by constitutional amendments passed before their grandparents were born. You live in this reality whether you're black or white, though the experience is profoundly different depending on which side of the colour line you stand. For black Americans, survival itself is an achievement, and building lives, families and communities under these conditions demonstrates extraordinary resilience. For white Americans, the system provides benefits whether they seek them or not, structuring their lives around racial privilege that many prefer not to acknowledge. But darkness eventually gives way to something lighter. The small celebrations that punctuate life regardless of circumstances, the holidays that provide respite from daily struggle. The calendar offers relief at predictable intervals, days marked for celebration, for gathering, for permission to set aside the endless labour and simply enjoy being alive. In 1880 America, holidays matter intensely, perhaps precisely because the rest of the year is so relentlessly demanding. These are the moments you anticipate through weeks of work, the memories you carry through months of ordinary time. Christmas is becoming the event it will remain for generations, though its modern form is still developing. The Christmas tree tradition, imported from Germany, has spread through American homes. Decorations festoon parlours and public spaces. The expectation of gift-giving is increasingly established, though the commercial Christmas of later eras hasn't fully emerged. Stores advertise special Christmas merchandise, and catalogues feature pages of potential presents, but the scale is modest by modern standards. The religious dimension of Christmas remains prominent. Church services draw large crowds, including people who might not attend regularly. Carols are sung in homes and in streets. The story of the Nativity provides narrative structure for the holiday, connecting celebration to theological meaning. For many families, Christmas is first a holy day, and second a holiday. The festivity is justified by the religious significance, rather than existing independently. Food marks the Christmas celebration. Special meals feature dishes that don't appear at other times. Roasted meats, rich desserts, candies and treats reserved for this occasion. Families who scrimp throughout the year might splurge at Christmas, the abundance of the table demonstrating both celebration and hope. The Christmas dinner is as much performance as meal, a demonstration that even modest families can produce moments of plenty. Here's a detail about 1880s Christmas. Santa Claus is an evolving figure. The modern image, red suit, white beard, reindeer and sleigh, is developing but not yet fixed. Different regions and ethnic communities have different gift-bringer traditions. Some families emphasize the Christ child as the source of gifts rather than Santa. The standardization that will eventually make Santa's image universal hasn't fully occurred. What is universal is the idea that children should receive special attention at Christmas, that gifts should appear for them however they are explained. The 4th of July offers a different kind of celebration, louder, more public, more explicitly national. Parades march through town streets. Politicians deliver orations celebrating American independence and progress. Fireworks illuminate the night in communities that can afford them. Picnics gather families and communities in outdoor celebrations that combine patriotism with pleasure. The 4th of July in 1880 is less universally celebratory than it might seem. For Black Americans, the holiday commemorates a Declaration of Independence that declared all men created equal, while authors and signers held people in slavery. Frederick Douglass's famous oration, "What to the 4th of July is to the slave," was delivered before the Civil War, but the sentiment remains relevant. The freedoms celebrated on July 4th are not fully extended to all Americans, and those excluded might observe the holiday with complicated feelings. Thanksgiving is not yet a universal American holiday in 1880. Lincoln declared a national Thanksgiving during the Civil War, but the observance varies by region and tradition. New England celebrates enthusiastically, other regions are less committed. The standardized Thanksgiving of later generations, the 4th Thursday in November, the turkey and stuffing and pumpkin pie, is still developing. But the basic concept of a harvest celebration, a day for gratitude and family gathering, exists and is spreading. Local holidays vary by community and circumstance. Harvest festivals celebrate the completion of agricultural labour, combining relief at work's end with celebration of abundance. Ethnic communities observe holidays from their home countries: German Christmas traditions, Italian saints' days, Jewish high holidays. County fairs bring rural communities together for competitions, exhibitions and entertainment. These local celebrations might matter more to daily life than the national holidays that will eventually dominate the calendar. Historians still argue about the function of holidays in industrial societies, whether they represent genuine respite from labour or simply regulated release that makes the rest of the year's exploitation more tolerable, probably both. The need for celebration is genuine, the joy experienced at holidays is real, and yet the structure of the calendar also serves interests beyond those of the people celebrating. Holidays are both authentic expressions of human need and managed features of an economic system. Birthday celebrations exist but are typically more modest than later generations will make them. Children might receive small gifts or special treats. The elaborate birthday party with guests, games and cake is emerging among the prosperous but not yet universal. Age matters in certain contexts, religious milestones, legal transitions to adulthood, but the annual personal celebration we now take for granted is still becoming established. Weddings and funerals mark life's major transitions with celebrations and rituals that vary by community, religion and resources. A wedding might be a simple civil ceremony or an elaborate church event followed by community celebration. Funerals, as we discussed, follow established mourning rituals that structure grief and provide community support. These life cycle events create their own holidays, days set apart from ordinary time, marked by special attention and social gathering. The year's rhythm is punctuated by these celebrations, creating a pattern that makes time manageable. You work toward the next holiday, remember the last one, use these markers to structure your understanding of passing time. Without weekends as we know them, without vacation time, without the regular leisure that later generations will expect, holidays carry extra weight. They're the designated breathing room in a life that otherwise allows little space for rest. The day's celebration ends eventually, as all celebrations do. The dishes are cleared, the children are put to bed, the house gradually quiets. Tomorrow will bring ordinary time again, the same work and concerns that fill every other day. But tonight there was something different, something special, something that made the ordinary bearable by providing contrast. Night's falling now, and with it comes the end of the day, and for our journey through 1880 America, the beginning of the end. The darkness that once meant danger now means rest, and rest is what awaits. The sun is setting, has been setting for some time now, and you feel it in your bones, that particular exhaustion that comes from a day lived fully in the physical world. The light fades from the windows, the shadows lengthen and merge, and the house begins its nightly transformation from workspace to sanctuary. Whatever tasks remain undone will remain undone until morning. The day is ending whether you're ready or not. You light the lamp, kerosene or candle, that familiar action that separates day from night, that brings light into darkness one small circle at a time. The flame flickers and steadies, casting shadows that dance on walls you've seen every day of your life. The light is warm, orange, nothing like the harsh brightness of future electrical illumination. It softens edges, makes the familiar mysterious, creates pools of visibility surrounded by gentle darkness. The evening meal is finished, the dishes washed or at least stacked for tomorrow's attention. The children are settling, their energy finally depleting after days that demanded as much from their small bodies as yours demanded from you. You hear them in the next room or the next bed, their voices quieting, their movements slowing, their breathing gradually deepening towards sleep. Children know how to surrender to tiredness in ways adults sometimes forget. The fire is banked for the night, embers buried under ash to slow their burning, preserving enough heat to restart tomorrow's flames without the full effort of beginning from cold. The stove ticks as metal contracts, a sound you've heard so often you barely register it anymore. The house is cooling, will be cold by morning, but for now there's still warmth enough. You prepare for bed in whatever way your circumstances allow. Perhaps you wash your face and hands, the water cool but not yet freezing. Perhaps you change from day clothes to night clothes, or perhaps you simply remove layers and sleep in what remains. The bed awaits, lumpy, familiar, shared with whoever shares your life. The sheets are rough by modern standards, the blankets heavy, the mattress an adventure in navigating stuffing that has shifted with use. The sounds of the night begin to assert themselves as human noise subsides. Insects if it's summer, their chorus rising and falling in patterns you've known since childhood. Wind against the windows, testing the seals, whistling through gaps that no amount of stuffing quite closes. Animals settling in their shelters, horses shifting weight in stalls, chickens quiet on their roosts. The distant sound of a dog barking, of voices you can't quite make out, of life continuing even as yours prepares to pause. You've lived a day in 1880 America. It's been hard, harder than modern people usually imagine when they romanticize the past. You've worked with your body in ways that most contemporary people never experience. You've dealt with discomforts that modern infrastructure has eliminated so thoroughly that they're hard even to imagine. You've navigated a world without the safety nets, the conveniences, the small mercies that later generations will take for granted. But you've also experienced things that modern life often lacks. Connection to the physical world, to the labour that sustains existence, to the rhythms of nature that artificial light and climate control will eventually obscure. Community in its direct, face-to-face form where neighbours know each other, depend on each other, celebrate and mourn together. Time measured by seasons and daylight rather than schedules and deadlines. A life of limitations that are also, in their way, clarifying. You know what matters because so much else has been stripped away. The lamp dims or you extinguish it deliberately, and darkness claims the room. Your eyes adjust. They've been adjusting to darkness all your life, and you can see shapes, vague forms, the suggestion of things you know are there. The darkness isn't frightening, it's familiar, expected, the natural state of night before humans learned to banish it. Your ancestors slept in this darkness for thousands of generations. Your descendants will rarely experience it. Sleep begins to pull at the edges of consciousness, that soft unravelling of attention that signals the body's readiness for rest. Thoughts drift, lose coherence, become images and fragments rather than organised concerns. The worries of the day don't disappear, but they recede, becoming background noise beneath the foreground of fatigue. Tomorrow they'll return, as they always do, but tomorrow is tomorrow. The night sounds continue, that distant dog, that closer cricket, the breathing of the person beside you, the creaking of a house settling into its nighttime self. These sounds are not silence, but they're not noise either. They're the texture of existence, the evidence that life continues even as you let go of your grip on it. The sounds become part of your dreaming, woven into whatever images your sleeping mind creates. The bed warms with your body heat, becomes a cocoon of sorts, and you surrender to it. The cold world outside the blankets becomes irrelevant. There's only this small space of warmth, this island of comfort in the general hardship. Your muscles release tension they've been holding all day. Your spine settles into whatever accommodation it's reached with the mattress. Your breathing slows, deepens, becomes the breath of sleep rather than waking. Let it all go now. The chores undone, the worries unresolved, the problems that will wait for morning's attention. Let them drift away like leaves on water, present but not yours to hold anymore. The night is for rest, and rest is what you've earned through hours of labour, through the simple but genuine achievement of getting through another day. The darkness is soft around you. The sounds fade to nothing, or to everything, or to the space between. The boundaries of self become fuzzy, expanding into something larger, or contracting to a single point of consciousness that's about to disappear entirely. You've been brave today, in all the small ways that living in 1880 America requires bravery. You've faced discomforts, uncertainties, labours that tested you. You've existed in a world that offered no guarantees, that could take everything from you at any moment, that required constant effort just to maintain your place in it. And you've survived. You're here, in this bed, at the end of this day, alive. That's enough. That's always been enough. Sleep now. The night stretches ahead, hours of darkness during which the world will continue without your conscious participation. Somewhere out there, people are still awake. Night workers, anxious parents, those kept up by pain or worry or the strange energy that sometimes refuses to settle. But you're not among them tonight. You're drifting, letting go. The day is over, the night is here, and tomorrow will come on its own terms, with its own demands, its own small joys and large labours. But that's tomorrow. For now, there's only this. The warmth of the blanket, the softness of the pillow, the presence of those you love nearby, the safety of the familiar dark. Rest now. The story continues, but you don't have to follow it. Close your eyes, they're already closed. Release your hold on waking life. Let sleep take you to wherever sleep goes. Sweet dreams.